Chapter 19 of the Silver Horde. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Silver Horde by Rex Beach. Chapter 19, in which a mutiny is threatened. Even after they were miles down the Sound, Boyd remained at his post, sweeping the waters astern with an anxious search for some swift harbor craft, the appearance of which would signal that his escape had been discovered. "I won't feel safe until we were past Port Townsend," he confessed to Cherry, who maintained a position at his side. "Why Port Townsend? We don't stop there." "No, but the police can wire from Seattle to stop us and take me off at that point." "If they find out their mistake." "They must have found it out long ago. That's why I've got Peasley forcing this old tub. She's doing 10 knots, and that's a breakneck speed for her. Once we're through the straits, I'll be satisfied. But meanwhile..." Emerson lowered his glasses with a sigh of fatigue, and in the soft twilight the girl saw that his face was lined and careworn. The yearning at her heart lent poignant sympathy to her words as she said, "You deserve to win, Boyd. You have made a good fight." "Oh, I'll win," he declared wearily. "I've got to win. Only I wish we were past Port Townsend." "What will happen to Fraser?" she queried. "Nothing serious, I'm sure. You see, they wanted me and nobody else. Once they find they have the wrong man, I rather believe they will free him in disgust." A moment later he went on, "Just the same, it makes me feel depressed and guilty to leave him. I wouldn't desert a comrade for anything if the choice lay with me." "You did quite right," Cherry warmly assured him. "You see, I'm not working for myself. I'm doing this for another." It was the girl's turn to sigh softly, while the eyes she turned toward the west were strangely sad and dreamy. To her companion she seemed not at all like the buoyant creature who had kindled his courage when it was so low, the brave girl who had stood so steadfastly at his shoulder and kept his hopes alive during these last trying weeks. It struck him suddenly that she had grown very quiet of late. It was the first time he had had the leisure to notice it. But now, when he came to reflect on it, he remembered that she had never seemed quite the same since his interview with her on that day when Hilliard had so unexpectedly come to his rescue. He wondered if in reality this change might not be due to some reflected alteration in himself. Well, he could not help it. Her strange behavior at that time had affected him more deeply than he would have thought possible, and while he had purposely avoided thinking much about the banker's sudden change of front, back of his devout thankfulness for the miracle was a vague suspicion, a curious feeling that made him uncomfortable in the girl's presence. He could not repent his determination to win at any price, yet he shrank with a moral cowardice which made him inwardly writhe, from knowing that Cherry had made the sacrifice at which Clyde and the others had hinted. If it were indeed true, it placed him in an intolerable position wherein he could express neither his gratitude nor his censure. No doubt she had read the signs of his mental confusion, and her own delicate sensibility had responded to it. They remained side by side on the bridge while the day died amidst a wondrous panoply of color, each busy with thoughts that might not be spoken. In their hearts, emotions oddly at variance. The sky ahead of them was wide streaked with gold, as if for a symbol, interlaid with sooty clouds in silhouette. On either side the mountains rose from the penumbral darkness to clear-cut heights still bright from the slanting radiance. Here and there, along the shadowy shoreline, a light was born. The smell of the salt sea was in the air. Above the rhythmic pulse of the steamer rose the voices of men, singing between decks, while the parting waters at the prow played a soft accompaniment. A steward summoned them to supper, but Boyd refused, saying he could not eat, and the girl stayed with him while the miles slowly slipped past and the night encompassed them. 2 hours more, he told her, as the ship's bell sounded. Then I can eat and sleep and sing. Captain Peasley was pacing the bridge when later they breasted the glare of Port Townsend and saw in the distance the flashing searchlights of the forts that guarded the straits. They saw him stop suddenly and raise his night glasses. Boyd laid his hand on Cherry's arm. Presently the captain crossed to them and said, "Yonder seems to be a launch making out. See? I wonder what's up." Almost in their path, a tiny light was violently agitated. "By Jove, they're signaling." "You won't stop, will you?" questioned Emerson. "I don't know, I'm sure. I may have to." The two boats were drawing together rapidly, and soon those on the bridge heard the faint but increasing patter of a gasoline exhaust. Carrying the same speed as the Bedford Castle, the launch shortly came within hailing distance. The cyclopean eye of the ship's searchlight blazed up, and the next instant out from the gloom leaped a little craft, on the deck of which a man stood, waving a lantern. She held steadfastly to her course, and a voice floated up to them. "Ahoy! What ship?" "The Bedford Castle, cannery tender for Bristow Bay," Peasley shouted back. The man on the launch relinquished his lantern, and using both palms for a funnel, cried, more clearly now, "Heave to! We want to come aboard." With an exclamation of impatience, the commanding officer stepped to the telegraph, but Emerson forestalled him. "Wait, they're after me, Captain. It's the Port Townsend police, and if you let them aboard, they'll take me off." "What makes you think so?" demanded Peasley. "Ask them." Turning, the skipper bellowed down the gleaming electric pathway. "Who are you?" "Police. We want to come aboard." "What did I tell you?" cried Emerson. Once more the captain shouted, "What do you want?" "One of your passengers, Emerson. Heave to! You're passing us." "That's bloody hard luck, Mr. Emerson. I can't help myself," the captain declared. But again Boyd blocked him as he started for the telegraph. "I won't stand it, sir. It's a conspiracy to ruin me." "But, my dear young man, don't touch that instrument." From the launch came cries of growing vehemence, and a startled murmur of voices rose from somewhere in the darkness of the deck beneath. "Stand aside," Peasley ordered gruffly, but the other held his ground, saying quietly, "I warn you, I'm desperate." "Shall I stop her, sir?" the quartermaster asked from the shadows of the wheelhouse. "No," Emerson commanded sharply, and in the glow from the binnacle light they saw he had drawn his revolver, while on the instant, up from the void beneath, heaved the massive figure of big George Balt, a behemoth more colossal and threatening than ever in the dim light. Rumbling curses as he came, he leaped up the pilot-house steps, wrenched open the door, and with one sweep of his hairy paw flung the helmsman from his post, panting, "Keep her going, Cap, or I'll run them down." "We stood by you, old man," Emerson urged. "You stand by us. They can't make you stop. They can't come aboard." The launch was abreast of them now, skimming along so close that one might have tossed a biscuit aboard of her. For an instant Captain Peasley hesitated. Then Emerson saw the ends of his bristling mustache rise above an expansive grin as he winked portentously, but his voice was convincingly loud and wrathful as he replied, "What do you mean, sir? I'll have my blooming ship libeled for this." "I'll make good your losses," Emerson volunteered quickly, realizing that other ears were open. "Why, it's mutiny, sir." "Exactly. You can say you went out under duress." "I never heard of such a thing," stormed the skipper. Then, more quietly, "But I don't seem to have any choice in the matter, do I?" "None whatever." "Then tell them to go to hell," growled Balt from the open window above their head. A blasphemous outcry floated up from the launch, while heads protruded from the deckhouse openings, the faces white in the slanting glare. "Why don't you heave to?" demanded a voice. Peasley stepped to the end of the bridge and called down, "I can't stop. My good man, they won't allow it, you know." "You'll have to bloody well come aboard yourself." Then, obedient to his command, the searchlight traced an arc through the darkness and died out, leaving the little craft in darkness, save for its dim lantern. Unseen by the amazed quartermaster, who was startled out of speech and action, Emerson gripped the captain's shoulder and whispered his thanks, while the Britisher grumbled under his breath. "By me, won't that labor crowd be hot? They nearly bashed in my head with that iron spike. 400 pounds, my word." The sputter of the craft alongside was now punctuated by such a volley of curses that he raised his voice again. "Belay that chatter, will you? There's a lady aboard." The police launch sheered off, and the sound of her exhaust grew rapidly fainter and fainter, but not until it had wholly ceased did Big George give over his post at the wheel. Even then he went down the ladder reluctantly, and without a word of thanks or explanation or of apology. With him, this had been but a part of the day's work. He saw neither sentiment nor humor in the episode. The clang of the deep-throated ship's bell spoke the hour, and, taking Cherry's arm, Boyd helped her to the deck. "Now let's eat something," said she. "Yes," he agreed, releasing triumph in his tone, "and drink something, too." "We'll drink to the health of Fingerless Fraser." "To the health of Fingerless Fraser," he echoed. "We will drink that standing." A week later, after an uneventful voyage across a sea of glass, the Bedford Castle made up through a swirling tide rip and into the fog-bound harbor of Unalaska. The soaring Goonies that had followed them from Flattery had dropped astern at the first sight of the volcanic headlands, and now countless thousands of sea parrots fled from the ship's path, squattering away in comic terror, dragging their fat bodies across the sea as a boy skips a flat rock. It had been Captain Peasley's hope, here at the gateway of the misty sea, to learn something about the lay of the big ice floes to the northward, but he was disappointed, for the season was yet too young for the revenue cutters, and the local hunters knew nothing. Forced to rely on luck and his own skill, he steamed out again the next day, this time doubling back to the eastward and laying a cautious course along the second leg of the journey. Once through the ragged barrier that separates the North Pacific from her sister sea, the dank breath of the Arctic smote them fairly. The breeze that wafted out from the north brought with it the chill of limitless ice fields, and the first night found them hove to among the outposts of that shifting desert of death which debouches out of the Bering Strait with the first approach of autumn, to retreat again only at the coming of reluctant summer. From the crow's nest, the lookout stared down upon a white expanse that stretched beyond the horizon. At dawn, they began their careful search, feeling their way eastward through the open lanes and tortuous passages that separated the floes, now laying to for the northward set of the fields to clear a path before them, now stealing through some narrow lead that opened into freer waters. The Bedford Castle was a steel hull whose sides opposed to the jaws of the ponderous masses would have been crushed like an eggshell in a vise. Unlike a wooden ship, the gentlest contact would have sprung her plates, while any considerable collision would have pierced her as if she had been built of paper. Appreciating to the full peril of his slow advance, Captain Peasley did all the navigating in person, but eventually they were hemmed in so closely for a day and a night that they could do nothing but drift with the pack. In time, however, the winds opened a crevice through which they retreated to follow the outer limits further eastward until they were balked again. Opposed to them were the forces of nature, and they were wholly dependent upon her fickle favor. It might be a day, a week, a month, before she would let them through, and even when the barrier began to yield, another ship, a league distant, might profit by an opening which to them was barred. For a long, dull period, the voyagers lay as helpless as if in a dry dock, while wandering herds of seals barked at them, or bands of walruses ceased their fishing and crept out upon the ice pans to observe these invaders of their peace. When an opportunity at last presented itself, they threaded their way southward, there to try another approach, and another, until the 1st of May had come and gone, leaving them but a little closer to their goal than when they first hove to. Late one evening they discerned smoke on the horizon, and the next morning's light showed a 3-masted steamship fast in the ice, a few miles to the westward. "That's the Juliet," Big George informed his companions, "one of the North American Packers Association tenders." "She was loading when we left Seattle," Boyd remarked. "It is Willis Marsh's ship, so he must be aboard," supplemented Cherry. "She's a wooden ship and built for this business. If we don't look out, he'll beat us in after all." "What good will that do him?" Clyde questioned. "The fish don't bite, run, for 60 days yet." Emerson and Balt merely shrugged. To Cherry Malotte, this had been a voyage of dreams, for once away from land, Boyd had become his real self again, that genial, irrepressible self she had seen but rarely, and his manner had lost the restraint and coolness which recently had disturbed their relations. Of necessity, their cramped environment had thrown them much together, and their companionship had been most pleasant. She and Boyd had spent long hours together, during which his light-heartedness had rivaled that of Alton Clyde, hours wherein she had come to know him more intimately and to feel that he was growing to a truer understanding of herself. She realized beyond all doubt that for him there was but one woman in all the world. Yet the mere pleasure of being near him was an anodyne for her secret distress. Womanlike, she took what was offered her and strove unceasingly for more. 2 days after sighting the Juliet, they raised another ship, one of the sailing fleet, which they knew to be hovering in the offing, and then, on the 5th of the month, the capricious current opened a way for them. Slowly at first, they pushed on between the floes in the vast area of slush ice, thence to a stretch as open and placid as a country mill pond. The lookout pointed a path out of this, into which they steamed, coming at length to clear water, with the low shores of the mainland 20 miles away. At sundown, they anchored in the wide estuary of the Cavalick River, the noisy rumble of their chains breaking the silence that for months had lain like a smother upon the port. The Indian village gave sign of life only in thin, azure wisps of smoke that rose from the dirt roofs. The cannery buildings stood as naked and as uninviting as when Boyd had last seen them. The Greek cross crowning the little white church was gilded by the evening sun. Through the glasses, Cherry spied a figure in the door of her house, which she declared was Constantine, but with commendable caution the big breed forbore to join the fleet of kayaks now rapidly mustering. Taking Clyde with them, she and Boyd were soon on their way to the land, leaving George to begin discharging his cargo. The long voyage that had maddened the fishermen was at last at an end, and they were eager to begin their tasks. The 3-mile pull brought the ship's boat to Cherry's Landing, where Constantine and Chakawana met them, the latter hysterical with joy, the former showing his delight in a rare display of white teeth and a flow of unintelligible English. Even the sledge dogs, now fat from idleness, greeted their mistress with a fierce clamor that dismayed Alton Clyde, to whom all was utterly new and strange. "Glory be!" he exclaimed. "They're nothing but wolves. Won't they bite? And the house, ain't it a hit? Why, it looks like a stage setting. Oh, say, I'm for this. I'm getting rough and primitive and brutal already." When they passed from the store, with its shelves sadly naked now, to the cozy living quarters behind, his enthusiasm knew no bounds. Leaving Chakawana and her mistress to chatter and clack in their patois, he inspected the premises inside and out, peering into all sorts of corners, collecting souvenirs, and making friends with the saturnine breed. Cherry would not return to the ship, but Emerson and Clyde re-embarked and were rowed down to the cannery site, abreast of which lay the Bedford Castle, where they lingered until the creeping twilight forced them to the boat again. When they reached the ship, the cool Arctic night had descended, but its quiet was broken by the halting nimble of steam winches, the creak of tackle, the cries of men, and the sounds of a great activity. Baring his head to the breezes, Boyd filled his lungs full of the bracing air, sweet with the flavor of spring, vowing secretly that no music that he had ever heard was the equal of this. He turned his face to the southward and smiled, while his thoughts sped a message of love and hope into the darkness. End of chapter 19. Recording by Richard Kilmer, Rio Medina, Texas.
Chapter 20 of The Silver Horde. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Michele Fry, Baton Rouge, Louisiana. The Silver Horde by Rex Beach, Chapter 20. Wherein Fingerless Fraser returns. Big George had lost no time, and already the towboats were overboard while a raft of timber was taking form alongside the ship. As soon as it was completed, it was loaded with crates and boxes and paraphernalia of all sorts, then towed ashore as the tide served. Another took its place, and another, and another. All that night the torches flared and the decks drummed to a ceaseless activity. In the morning, Boyd sent a squad of fishermen ashore to clear the ground for his buildings, and all day new rafts of lumber and material helped to increase the pile at the water's edge. His early training as an engineer now stood him in good stead, for 1,000 details demanded expert supervision. But he was as completely at home at this work as was Big George in his own part of the undertaking, and it was not long before order began to emerge from what seemed a hopeless chaos. Never did men have more willing hands to do their bidding than did he and George, and when a week later the Juliet, with Willis Marsh on board, came to anchor, the bunkhouses were up and peopled, while the new site had become a beehive of activity. The mouth of the Kalvik River is several miles wide, yet it contains but a small anchorage suitable for deep-draught ships, the rest of the harbor being underlaid with mud bars and tide flats over which none but small boats may pass. And as the canneries are distributed up and down the stream for a considerable distance, it is necessary to transport all supplies to and from the ships by means of tugs and lighters. Owing to the narrowness of the channel, the Juliet came to her moorings not far from the Bedford Castle. To Marsh, already furious at the trick the ice had played him, this forced proximity to his rival brought home with added irony the fact that he had been forestalled, while it emphasized his knowledge that henceforth the conflict would be carried on at closer quarters. It would be a contest between two men, both determined to win by fair means or foul. Emerson was a dream-dazzled youth, striving like a knight-errant for the love of a lady and the glory of conquest. But he was also a born fighter, and in every emergency he had shown himself as able as his experienced opponent. As Marsh looked about and saw how much Boyd's well-directed energy was accomplishing, he was conscious of a slight disheartenment. Still, he was on his own ground, he had the advantage of superior force, and though he was humiliated by his failure to throttle the hostile enterprise in its beginning, he was by no means at the end of his expedients. He was curious to see his rival in action, and he decided to visit him and test his temper. It was on the afternoon following his arrival that Marsh, after a tour of inspection, landed from his launch and strolled up to where Boyd Emerson was at work. He was greeted courteously, if a bit coolly, and found, as on their last meeting, that his own bearing was reflected exactly in that of Boyd. Both men, beneath the scant politeness of their outward manner, were aware that the time for ceremony had passed. Here in the Northland they faced each other at last, as man to man. "I see you have a number of my old fishermen," March observed. "Yes, we were fortunate in getting such good ones." "You were fortunate in many ways. In fact, you are a very lucky young man." "Indeed? How?" "Well, don't you think you were lucky to beat that strike?" "It wasn't altogether luck. However, I do consider myself fortunate in escaping at the last moment." Boyd laughed easily. "By the way, what happened to the man they mistook for me?" "Let him go, I believe. I didn't pay much attention to the matter." Marsh had been using his eyes to good advantage, and seeing the work even better in hand than he had supposed, he was moved by irritation and the desire to goad his opponent to say more than he had intended. "I rather think you will have a lot to explain one of these days," he said, with deliberate menace. "With 50,000 cases of salmon aboard the Bedford Castle, I will explain anything. Meanwhile, the police may go to the devil." The cool assurance of the young man's tone roused his would-be tormentor like a personal affront. "You got away from Seattle, but there is a commissioner at Dutch Harbor, also a deputy marshal, who may have better success with a warrant than those policemen had." The Trust's manager could not keep down the angry tremor in his voice, and the other, perceiving it, replied in a manner designed to inflame him still more. "Yes, I have heard of those officers. I understand they are both in your employ." "What?" "I hear you have bought them." "Do you mean to insinuate—" "I don't mean to insinuate anything. Listen, we are where we can talk plainly, Marsh, and I am tired of all this subterfuge. You did what you could to stop me. You even tried to have me killed." "You dare to— But I guess it never occurred to you that I may be just as desperate as you are." The men stared at each other with hostile eyes, but the accusation had come so suddenly and with such boldness as to rob Marsh of words. Emerson went on in the same level voice. "I broke through in spite of you, and I'm on the job. If you want to cry quits, I'm willing, but by God, I won't be balked, and if any of your hired marshals try to take me before I put up my catch, I'll put you away. Understand?" Willis Marsh recoiled involuntarily before the sudden ferocity that blazed up in the speaker's face. "You are insane," he cried. "Am I?" Emerson laughed harshly. "Well, I'm just crazy enough to do what I say. I don't think you're the kind that wants hand-to-hand trouble. So let's each attend to his own affair. I'm doing well, thank you, and I think I can get along better if you don't come back here until I send for you. Something might fall on you." Marsh's full red lips went pallid with rage as he said, "Then it is to be war, eh?" "Suit yourself." Boyd pointed to the shore. "Your boatman is waiting for you." As Marsh made his way to the water's edge, he stumbled like a blind man. His lips were bleeding where his small sharp teeth had bitten them, and he panted like an hysterical woman. During the next fortnight, the sailing ships began to assemble, standing in under a great spread of canvas to berth close alongside the two steamships, for once the ice had moved north, there was no further obstacle to their coming, and the harbor was soon livened with puffing tugs, unwieldy lighters, and fleets of smaller vessels. Where but a short time before the brooding silence had been undisturbed, save for the plaint of wolf dogs and the lazy voices of natives, a noisy army was now at work. The bustle of a great preparation arose. Languid smoke wreaths began to unfurl above the stacks of the canneries. The stamp and clank of tin machines re-echoed. Hammer and saw maintained a never-ceasing hubbub. Down at the new plant, scows were being launched while yet the pitch was warm on their seams. Buildings were rising rapidly, and a crew had gone up the river to get out a raft of piles. On the morning after the arrival of the last ship, Emerson and his companions were treated to a genuine surprise. Cherry had come down to the site as usual. She could not let a day go by without visiting the place, and Clyde, after a tardy breakfast, had just come ashore. They were watching Big George direct the launching of a scow, when all of a sudden they heard a familiar voice behind them cry, cheerfully, "Halo, white folks, here we are, all together again." They turned to behold a villainous-looking man beaming benignly upon them. He was dirty, his clothes were in rags, and through a riotous bristle of beard that hid his thin features, a mangy patch showed on either cheek. It was undeniably Fingerless Fraser, but how changed, how altered from that radiant flower of indolence they had known. He was pallid, emaciated, and bedraggled. His attitude showed hunger and abuse, and his bony joints seemed about to pierce through their tattered covering. As they stood speechless with amazement, he made his identification complete by protruding his tongue from the corner of his mouth and gravely closing one eye in a wink of exceeding wisdom. "Fraser!" they cried in chorus, then fell upon him noisily, shaking his grimy hands and slapping his back until he coughed weakly. Summoned by their shouts, Big George broke in upon the incoherent greeting, and at sight of his late comrade began to laugh hoarsely. "Glad to see you, old man," he cried. "But how did you get here?" Fraser drew himself up with injured dignity, then spoke in dramatic accents. "I worked my way." He showed the whites of his eyes, tragically. "You look like you'd walked in from Kansas," George declared. "Yes, sir. I worked. Me." "How? Where?" "On that bloody windjammer." He stretched a long arm toward the harbor in a theatrical gesture. "But the police?" queried Boyd. "Oh, I squared them easy. It's you they want. Yes, sir. I worked." Again he scanned their faces anxiously. "I'm a scullery maid." "What?" "That's what I said. I've rustled garbage cans till the smell of food gives me a cold sweat. I'm as hungry as a starving Cuban, and yet the sight of a knife and fork turns my stomach." He wheeled suddenly upon Alton Clyde, whose burst of shrill laughter offended him. "Don't cry. Your sympathy unmans me." "Tell us about it," urged Cherry. "What's the use?" he demanded with a glare at Clyde. "That bonehead wouldn't understand." "Go ahead," Boyd seconded, with twitching lips. "You look as if you had worked, and worked hard." "Hard? I'm the only man in the world who knows what hard work is." "Start at the beginning, when you were arrested." "Well, I didn't care nothing about the sneeze." He took up the tale. "For I figured out that they can't slough me without clearing you, so I never take no sleeping powders, and sure enough, 'bout third drink time the bulls spring me, and I screw down the main stem to the drink and get Jerry to your fade." "Tell it straight," interrupted Cherry. "They don't understand you." "Well, they ain't any Pullmans running to this resort, so I stow away on a coal burner, but somebody flags me. Then I try to hire out as a fisherman, but I ain't there with the gang talk and my stuff drags, so I fix it for a hideaway on the Blessed Isle. That's her name. Can you beat that for a moniker? This sailor of mine goes good to grub me, but he never shows for 48 hours, or years, I forget which. Anyhow, I stand it as long as I can, then I dig my way up to a hatch and mew like a house cat. It seems they were hep from the start, and battened me down on purpose, then made book on how long I'd stay hid. Oh, it's a funny joke, and they all got a stomach laugh when I show. When I offer to pay my way, they're insulted. Nix, that ain't their graft. They wouldn't take money from a stranger. Oh, no. They permit me to work my way. The scullion has quit, see, so they promote me to his job. It's the only job I ever held, and I held it because it wouldn't let go of me, savvy? There's only 300 men aboard the Blessed Isle, so all I have to do, regular, is to understudy the cooks, carry the grub, wait on table, wash the dishes, mop the floors, make the officers' beds, peel 6 bushels of potatoes a day, and do the laundry. Then, of course, there's some odd tasks. Oh, it was a swell job, more like a pastime. When a mop sees me coming now, it dances a hornpipe, and I can't look a dish rag in the face. All I see in my dreams is potato parings and meat rinds. I've got dishwater in my veins, and the whole universe looks greasy to me. Naturally, it was my luck to pick the slowest ship in the harbor. We lay 3 weeks in the ice, that's all, and nobody worked but me and the seagulls. You deserted this morning, eh? I did. I beat the barrier, and now I want a bath and some clean clothes and a whole lot of sleep. You don't need to disturb me till fall. He showed no interest whatever in the new plant, refusing even to look it over or to express an opinion upon the progress of the work, so they sent him out to the ship, where for days he remained in a toad-like lethargy, basking in the sun, sleeping 3/4 of the time, and spending his waking hours in repeating the awful tale of his disgraceful peonage. To unload the machinery, particularly the heavier pieces, was by no means a simple matter, owing to the furious tides that set in and out of the Kalvik River. The first mishap occurred during the trip on which the boilers were towed in, and it looked to Boyd less like an accident than a carefully planned move to cripple him at one stroke. The other ships were busily discharging, and the roadstead was alive with small craft of various kinds, when the huge boilers were swung over the side of the Bedford Castle and blocked into position for their journey to the shore. George and a half-dozen of his men went along with the load, while Emerson remained on the ship. They were just well under way when, either by the merest chance or by malicious design, several of the rival company's towboats, moored to the neighboring ships, cast off. The anchorage was crowded, and the boiling 6-mile tide made it difficult at best to avoid collision. Hearing a confused shout to shoreward, Boyd ran to the rail in time to see one of the company's tugs at the head of a string of towboats, bearing down ahead of the current directly upon his own slow-moving lighter. Already it was so close at hand as to make disaster seem inevitable. He saw Balt wave his arms furiously, and heard him bellow profane warnings, while the fishermen scurried about excitedly. But still the tug held to its course. Boyd raised his voice in a wild alarm, but had they heard him, there was nothing they could have done. Then suddenly the affair altered its complexion. The oncoming tug was barely twice its length from the scow, when Boyd saw Big George cease his violent antics and level a revolver directly at the wheelhouse of the opposing craft. 2 puffs of smoke issued from weapon, then out from the glass-encased structure the steersman plunged, scrambled down the deck and into the shelter of the house. Instantly the bow of the tug swung off, and she came on sidewise, striking Balt's scow a glancing blow, the sound of which rose above the shouts, while its force threw the big fellow and his companions to their knees and shattered the glass in the pilot-house windows. The boats behind fouled each other, then drifted down upon the scow, and the tide, seizing the whole flotilla, began to spin it slowly. Rushing to the ladder, Emerson leaped into another launch, which fortunately was at hand, and the next instant, as the little craft sped out from the side of the Bedford Castle, he saw that a fight was in progress on the lighter. It was over quickly, and before he reached the scene, the current had drifted the tows apart. George, it seemed, had boarded the tug, dragged the captain off, and beaten him half insensible before the man's companions had come to his rescue. "Is the scow damaged?" Emerson cried, as he came alongside. "She's leaking, but I guess we can make it," George reassured him. They directed the second launch to make fast, and towed by both tugs, they succeeded in beaching their cargo a mile below the landing. "We'll caulk her at low tide," George declared, well satisfied at this outcome of the misadventure. Then he fell to reviling the men who had caused it. "Don't waste your breath on them," Boyd advised. "We're lucky enough as it is. If that tug hadn't sheered off, she would have cut us down sure." "That fellow done it a purpose," George swore. "Seamen ain't that careless. He tried to tell me he was rattled, but I rattled him." "If that's the case, they may try it again," said the younger man. "Huh! I'll pack a 30-30 from now on, and I bet they don't get within hailing distance without an ironclad." The more calmly Emerson regarded the incident, the more he marveled at the good fortune that had saved him. "We had better wake up," he said. "We have been asleep so far. If Marsh planned this, he will plan something more." "Yes, and if he puts one wallop over, we're done for," George agreed pessimistically. "I'll keep a watchman aboard the scows hereafter. That's our vital spot." But the days sped past without further interference, and the construction of the plant progressed by leaps and bounds, while the Bedford Castle, having discharged her cargo, steamed away to return in August. The middle of June brought the first king salmon, scouts sent on ahead of the sockeyes, but Boyd made no effort to take advantage of this run, laboring manfully to prepare for the advance of the main army, that terrific horde that was soon to come from the mysterious depths, either to make or ruin him. Once the run proper started, there would be no more opportunity for building or for setting up machinery. He must be ready and waiting by the 1st of July. For some time his tin machines had been busy, night and day, turning out great heaps of gleaming cans, while the carpenters and machinists completed their tasks. The gill netters were overhauling their gear. The beach was lined with fishing boats. On the dock, great piles of seines and drift nets were being inspected. 3 miles below, Big George, with a picked crew and a pile driver, was building the fish trap. It consisted of half-mile leads, or rows of piling, capped with stringers, upon which netting was hung, and terminated in hearts, corrals, and spillers, the intricate arrangements of webbing and timbers out of which the fish were to be taken. It was for the title to the ground where his present operations were going forward that George had been so cruelly disciplined by the interests, and while he had held stubbornly to his rights for years in spite of the bitterest persecution, he was now for the first time able to utilize his sight. Accordingly, his exultation was tremendous. As for Boyd, the fever in his veins mounted daily as he saw his dream assuming concrete form. The many problems arising as the work advanced afforded him unceasing activity. The unforeseen obstacles which were encountered hourly required swift and certain judgment, taxing his ingenuity to the utmost. He became so filled with it all, so steeped with the spirit of his surroundings, that he had thought for nothing else. Every dawn marked the beginning of a new battle. Every twilight heralded another council. His duties swamped him. He was worried, exultant, happy. Always he found Cherry at his shoulder, unobtrusive and silent for the most part, yet intensely observant and keenly alive to every action. She seemed to have the faculty of divination, knowing when to be silent and when to join her mood with his, and she gave him valuable help, for she possessed a practical mind and a masculine aptitude for details that surprised both him and George. But, rapidly as the work progressed, it seemed that good fortune would never smile upon them for long. One day, when their preparations were nearly completed, a foreman came to Boyd and said excitedly, "Boss, I'd like you to look at the iron chinks right away." "What's up?" "I don't know, but something is wrong." A hurried examination showed the machines to be cunningly crippled. Certain parts were entirely missing, while others were broken. "They were all right when we brought them ashore," the man declared. "Somebody's been at them lately." "When? How?" questioned Boyd. "We have had watchmen on guard all the time. Have any strangers been about?" "Nobody seems to know. When I got ready to set 'em just now, I saw this." The iron chink, or mechanical cleaner, is perhaps the most ingenious of the many labor-saving devices used in the salmon fisheries. It is an awkward-looking yet very effective contrivance of revolving knives and conveyors which seizes the fish whole and delivers it cleaned, clipped, cut, and ready to be washed. With superhuman dexterity it does the work of 20 lightning-like butchers. Without the aid of these iron chinks, Boyd knew that his fish would spoil before they could be handled. In a panic, he pursued his investigation far enough to realize that the machines were beyond repair, that what had seemed at first a trivial mishap was in fact an appalling disaster. Then, since his own experience left him without resource, he hastened straightway to George Balt. A half-hour's run down the bay, and he clambered from his launch to the pile-driver, where, amid the confusion and noise, he made known his tidings. The big fellow's calmness amazed him. "What are you going to do now?" "Butcher by hand," said the fisherman. "But how? That takes skilled labor, lots of it." George grinned. "I'm too old a bird to be caught like this. I figured on accidents from the start, and when I hired my Chinamen, I included a crew of cutters." "By Jove, you never told me." "There wasn't no use. We ain't licked yet, not by a damn sight. Willis March will have to try again." End of chapter 20. Chapter 21 of The Silver Horde. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Michele Fry, Baton Rouge, Louisiana. The Silver Horde by Rex Beach. Chapter 21. A Hand in the Dark. While they were talking, a tugboat towing a pile-driver came into view. Boyd asked the meaning of its presence in this part of the river. "I don't know," answered Big George, staring intently. "Yonder looks like another one behind it, with a raft of piles." "I thought all the company traps were upstream." "So they are. I can't tell what they're up to." A half-hour later, when the new flotilla had come to anchor a short distance below, Emerson's companion began to swear. "I might have known it." "What?" "Marsh aims to cork us." "What is that?" "He's going to build a trap on each side of this one and cut off our fish." "Good Lord, can he do that?" "Sure, why not? The law gives us 600 yards both ways. As long as he stays outside of that limit, he can do anything he wants to." "Then of what use is our trap? The salmon follow definite courses close to the shore, and if he intercepts them before they reach us, why, then we'll get only what he lets through." "That's his plan," said Big George sourly, "but it don't always work. You can't tell what salmon will do till they do it. I've studied this point of land for 5 years, and I know more about it than anybody else except God Almighty. If the fish hug the shore, then we're up against it, but I think they strike in about here. That's why I chose this site. We can't tell, though, till the run starts. All we can do now is see that them people keep their distance." The lead of a salmon trap consists of a row of web-hung piling that runs out from the shore for many hundred feet, forming a high, stout fence that turns the schools of fish and leads them into cunningly contrived enclosures, or pounds, at the outer extremity, from which they are brailed as needed. These corrals are so built that once the fish are inside they cannot escape. The entire structure is devised upon the principle that the salmon will not make a short turn, but will swim as nearly as possible in a straight line. It looked to Boyd as if Marsh, by blocking the line of progress above and below, had virtually destroyed the efficiency of the new trap, rendering the cost of its construction a total loss. "Sometimes you can cork a trap and sometimes you can't," Balt went on. "It all depends on the currents, the lay of the bars, and a lot of things we don't know nothing about. I've spent years in trying to locate the point where the fish strike in, and I think it's just below here. It'll all depend on how good I guessed." "Exactly. And if you guessed wrong?" "Then we'll fish with nets like we used to before there was any traps." That evening, when he had seen the night shift started, Emerson decided to walk up to Cherry's house, for he was worried over the day's developments and felt that an hour of the girls' society might serve to clear his thoughts. His nerves were high-strung from the tension of the past weeks, and he knew himself in the condition of an athlete trained to the minute. In his earlier days he had frequently felt the same nervousness, the same intense mental activity, just prior to an important race or game, and he was familiar with those disquieting, panicky moments when, for no apparent reason, his heart thumped and a physical sickness mastered him. He knew that the fever would leave him once the salmon began to run, just as it had always vanished at the crack of the starter's pistol or the shrill note of the referee's whistle. He was eager for action, eager to find himself possessed of that gloating, grueling fury that drives men through to the finish line. Meanwhile, he was anxious to divert his mind into other channels. Cherry's house was situated a short distance above the cannery which served as Willis Marsh's headquarters, and Boyd's path necessarily took him past his enemy's very stronghold. Finding the tide too high to permit of passing beneath the dock, he turned up among the buildings, where, to his surprise, he encountered his own day foreman talking earnestly with a stranger. The fisherman started guiltily as he saw him, and Boyd questioned him sharply. "What are you doing here, Larson?" "I just walked up after supper to have a talk with an old mate." "Who is he?" Boyd glanced suspiciously at Larson's companion. "He's Mr. Marsh's foreman." Emerson spoke out bluntly. "See here, I don't like this. These people have caused me a lot of trouble already, and I don't want my men hanging around here." "Oh, that's all right," said Larson carelessly. "Him and me used to fish together." And as if this were a sufficient explanation, he turned back to his conversation, leaving Emerson to proceed on his way, vaguely displeased at the episode, yet reflecting that heretofore he had never had occasion to doubt Larson's loyalty. He found Cherry at home, and flinging himself into one of her easy chairs, relieved his mind of the day's occurrences. "Marsh is building those traps purely out of spite," she declared indignantly when he had finished. "He doesn't need any more fish. He has plenty of traps further up the river." "To be sure, it looks as if we might have to depend upon the gill netters. We will know before long. If the fish strike in where George expects, Marsh will be out a pretty penny. And if they don't strike in where George expects, we will be out all the expense of building that trap." "Exactly. It's a fascinating business, isn't it? It's a business in which the unexpected is forever happening. But the stakes are high, and I know you will succeed." Boyd smiled at her comforting assurance. Her belief in him was always stimulating. "By the way," she continued, "have you heard the historic story about the pink salmon?" He shook his head. "Well, there was a certain shrewd old cannery man in Washington State whose catch consisted almost wholly of pink fish. As you know, that variety does not bring as high a price as red salmon like these. Well, finding that he could not sell his catch, owing to the popular prejudice about color, this man printed a lot of striking can labels, which read, 'Best grade pink salmon, warranted not to turn red in the can.' They tell me it worked like a charm." "No wonder." Boyd laughed, beginning to feel the tension of his nerves relax at the restfulness of her influence. As usual, he fell at once into the mood she desired for him. He saw that her brows were furrowed and her rosy lips drawn into an unconscious pout as she said, more to herself than to him, "I wish I were a man. I'd like to engage in a business of this sort, something that would require ingenuity and daring. I'd like to handle big affairs." "It seems to me that you are in a business of that sort. You are one of us." "Oh, but you and George are doing it all." "There's your copper mine. You surely handled that very cleverly." Sherry's expression altered, and she shot a quick glance at him as he went on. "How's it coming along, by the way? I haven't heard you mention it lately." "Very well, I believe. The men were down the other day and told me it was a big thing." "I'm delighted. How does it seem to be rich?" There was the slightest hint of constraint in the girl's voice as she stared out at the slowly gathering twilight, murmuring, "I hardly know. Rich? That has always been my dream, and yet—" "The wonderful feature about dreams," he took advantage of her pause to say, "is that they come true." "Not all of them. Not the real wonderful dreams," she returned. "Oh, yes, my dream is coming true, and so is yours." "I have given up hoping for that," she said, without turning. "But you shouldn't give up. Remember that all the great things ever accomplished were only dreams at first, and the greater the accomplishments, the more impossible they seemed to begin with." Something in the girl's attitude and in her silence made him feel that his words rang hollow and commonplace. While they had talked, an unaccustomed excitement had been mounting in his brain, and it held him now in a kind of delicious embarrassment. It was as if both had been suddenly enfolded in a new and mysterious understanding without the need of speech. He did not tell himself that Cherry loved him, but he roused to a fresh perception of her beauty, and felt himself privileged in her nearness. At the same time he was seized with the old half-resentful curiosity to learn her history. What wealth of romance lay shadowed in her eyes, what tragic story was concealed by her consistent silence, he could only guess. For she was a woman who spoke rarely of herself and lived wholly in the present. Her very reticence inspired confidence, and Boyd felt sure that here was a girl to whom one might confess the inmost secrets of a wretched soul, and rest secure in the knowledge that his confession would be inviolate, as if locked in the heart of mountains. He knew her for a steadfast friend, and he felt that she was beautiful, not only in face and form, but in all those little indescribable mannerisms which stamp the individual. And this girl was here alone with him, so close that by stretching out his arms he might enfold her. She allowed him to come and go at will. Her intimacy with him was almost like that of an unspoiled boy, yet different, so different that he thrilled at the thought, and the blood pounded up in his throat. It may have been the unusual ardor of his gaze that warmed her cheeks and brought her eyes back from the world outside. At any rate, she turned, flashing him a startled glance that caused his pulse to leap anew. Her eyes widened, and a flush spread slowly upward to her hair. Then her lids drooped, as if weighted by unwonted shyness, and rising silently, she went past him to the piano. Never before had she surprised that look in his eyes, and at the realization a wave of confusion surged over her. She strove to calm herself through her music, which shielded while it gave expression to her mood, and neither spoke as the evening shadows crept in upon them. But the girl's exaltation was short-lived. The thought came that Boyd's feeling was but transitory. He was not the sort to burn lasting incense before more than one shrine. Nevertheless, at this moment he was hers, and in the joy of that certainty she let the moments slip. He stopped her at last, and they talked in the half-light, floating along together half dreamily, as if upon the bosom of some great current that bore them into strange regions which they dreaded yet longed to explore. They heard a child crying somewhere in the rear of the house, and Chakawanna's voice soothing, then in a moment the Indian girl appeared in the doorway, saying something about going out with Constantine. Cherry acquiesced half-consciously, impatient of the intrusion. For a long time they talked, so completely in concord that for the most part their voices were low and their sentences so incomplete that they would have sounded incoherent and foolish to other ears. They were roused finally by the appreciation that it had grown very late and a storm was brewing. Boyd rose, and going to the door, saw that the sky was deeply overcast, rendering the night as dark as in a far lower latitude. "I've overstayed my welcome," he ventured, and smiled at her answering laugh. With a trace of solicitude she said, "Wait, I'll get you a raincoat." But he reached out a detaining hand. In the darkness it encountered the bare flesh of her arm. "Please don't. You'd have to strike a light to find it, and I don't want a light now." He was standing on the steps with her slightly above him, and so close that he heard her sharp-drawn breath. "It has been a pleasant evening," she said, inanely. "I saw you for the first time tonight, Cherry. I think I have begun to know you." Again she felt her heart leap. Reaching out to say good-bye, his hand slipped down over her arm like a caress until her palm lay in his. With trembling, gentle hands she pushed him from her, but even when the sound of his footsteps had died away, she stood with eyes straining into the gloom, in her breast a gladness so stifling that she raised her hands to still its tumult. Emerson, with the glow still upon him, felt a deep contentment which he did not trouble to analyze. It has been said that two opposite impulses may exist side by side in a man's mind, like two hostile armies which have camped close together in the night, unrevealed to each other until the morning. To Emerson the dawn had not yet come. He had no thought of disloyalty to Mildred, but, after his fashion, took the feeling of the moment unreflectively. His mood was averse to thought, and, moreover, the darkness forced him to give instant attention to his path. While the waters of the bay out to his right showed a ghostly gray, objects beneath the bluff where he walked were cloaked in impenetrable shadow. The air was damp with the breath of coming rain, and at rare intervals he caught a glimpse of the torn edges of clouds hurrying ahead of a wind that was yet unfelt. When the black bulk of Marsh's cannery loomed ahead of him, he left the gravel beach and turned up among the buildings, seeking to retrace his former course. He noticed that once he had left the noisy shingle, his feet made no sound in the soft moss. Thus it was that, as he turned the corner of the first building, he nearly ran against a man who was standing motionless against the wall. The fellow seemed as startled at the encounter as Emerson, and with a sharp exclamation leaped away and vanished into the gloom. Boyd lost no time in gaining the plank runway that led to the dock, and finding an angle in the building, backed into it and waited, half suspecting that he had stumbled into a trap. He reflected that both the hour and the circumstance were unpropitious, for in case they should meet with foul play, Marsh might plausibly claim that he had been mistaken for a marauder. He determined, therefore, to proceed with the greatest caution. From his momentary glimpse of the man as he made off, he knew that he was tall and active, just the sort of person to prove dangerous in an encounter. But if his suspicions were correct, there must be others close by, and Boyd wondered why he had heard no signal. After a breathless wait of a moment or two, he stole cautiously out, and selecting the darkest shadows, slipped from one to another till he was caught by the sound of voices issuing from the yawning entrance of the main building on his right. The next moment his tension relaxed. One of the speakers was a woman. Evidently his alarm had been needless, for these people, whoever they were, made no effort to conceal their presence. On the contrary, the woman had raised her tone to a louder pitch, although her words were still undistinguishable. Greatly relieved, Boyd was about to go on when a sharp cry, like a signal, came in the woman's voice, a cry which turned to a genuine wail of distress. The listener heard a man's voice cursing in answer, and then the sound of a scuffle, followed at length by a choking cry that brought him bounding into the building. He ran forward recklessly, but before he had covered half the distance, he collided violently with a piece of machinery and went sprawling to the floor. A glance upward revealed the dim outlines of a topper and showed him farther down the building, silhouetted briefly against the lesser darkness of the windows, two struggling figures. As he regained his footing, something rushed past him. Man or animal, he could not tell which, for its feet made no more sound upon the floor than those of a wolf dog. Then, as he bolted forward, he heard a man cry out, and found himself in the midst of turmoil. His hands encountered a human body, and he seized it, only to be hurled aside as if with a giant's strength. Again he clenched with a man's form and bore it to the floor, cursing at the darkness and reaching for its throat. His antagonist raised his voice in wild clamor, while Boyd braced himself for another assault from those huge hands he had met a moment before. But it did not come. Instead, he heard a cry from the woman, an answer in a deeper voice, and then swift, pattering footsteps growing fainter. Meanwhile, the man with whom he was locked was fighting desperately, with hands and feet and teeth, shouting hoarsely. Other footsteps sounded now, this time approaching. Then at the door a lantern flared. A watchman came running down between the lines of machinery, followed by other figures half revealed. Boyd had pinned his antagonist against the cold sides of a retort at last, and with fingers clutched about his throat, was beating his head violently against the iron, when by the lantern's gleam he caught one glimpse of the fat, purple face in front of him, and loosed his hold with a startled exclamation. Released from the grip that had nearly made an end of him, Willis Marsh staggered to his feet, then lurched forward as if about to fall from weakness. His eyes were staring, his blackened tongue protruded, while his head, battered and bleeding, lolled grotesquely from side to side, as if in a hideous merriment. His clothes were torn and soiled from the litter underfoot, and he presented a frightful picture of distress. But it was not this that caused Emerson the greatest astonishment. The man was wounded, badly wounded, as he saw by the red stream which gushed down over his breast. Boyd cast his eyes about for the other participants in the encounter, but they were nowhere visible. Only an open door in the shadows close by hinted at the mode of their disappearance. There was a brief, noisy interval, during which Emerson was too astounded to attempt an answer to the questions hurled broadcast by the newcomers. Then Marsh leveled a trembling finger at him and cried hysterically, "There he is, men! He tried to murder me! I'm hurt! I'll have him arrested!" The seriousness of the accusation struck the young man on the instant. He turned upon the group. "I didn't do that. I heard a fight going on and ran in here." "He's a liar!" the wounded man interrupted shrilly. "He stabbed me, see?" He tried to strip the shirt from his wounds, then fell to chattering and shaking. "Oh, God, I'm hurt!" He staggered to a packing case and sank upon it, weakly fumbling at his sodden shoulder. "I didn't do that," repeated Boyd. "I don't know who stabbed him. I didn't." "Then who did?" someone demanded. "What are you doing in here? You'd have killed him in a minute," said the man with the lantern. "We'll fix you for this," a third voice threatened. "Listen," Boyd said in a tone to make them pause. "There has been a mistake here. I was passing the building when I heard a woman scream, and I rushed in to prevent Marsh from choking her to death." "A woman?" chorused the group. "That's what I said." "Where is she now?" "I don't know. I didn't see her at all. I grappled with the first person I ran into. She must have gone out as you came in." Boyd indicated the side door, which was still ajar. "It's a lie!" screamed Marsh. "It's the truth," stoutly maintained Emerson. "And there was a man with her, too. Who was she, Marsh? Who was the man?" She, I don't know." "Don't lie." "I'm hurt," reiterated the stricken man feebly. Then, seeing the bewilderment in the faces about him, he burst out anew. "Don't stand there like a lot of fools. Why don't you get him?" "If I stabbed him, I must have had a knife," Emerson said, again checking the forward movement. "You may search me if you like. See?" He opened his coat and displayed his belt. "He's got a 6-shooter," someone said. "Yes, and I may use it," said Emerson quietly. "Maybe he dropped the knife," said the watchman, and began to search about the floor, followed by the others. "It may have been the woman herself who stabbed Mr. Marsh," offered Emerson. "He was strangling her when I arrived." Roused by this statement to a fresh denial, Marsh cried out, "I tell you there wasn't any woman." "And there isn't any knife either," Emerson sneered. The men paused uncertainly. Seeing that they were undecided whether to believe him or his assailant, Marsh went on, "If he hasn't a knife, then he must have had a friend with him." "Then tell your men what we were doing in here, and how you came to be alone with us in the dark." Emerson stared at his accuser curiously, but the Trust's manager seemed at a loss. "See here, Marsh, if you will tell us whom you were choking, maybe we can get at the truth of this affair." Without answering, Marsh rose, and leaning upon the watchman's arm, said, "Help me up to the house. I'm hurt. Send the launch to the upper plant for John. He knows something about medicine." With no further word, he made his way out of the building, followed by the mystified fishermen. No one undertook to detain Emerson, and he went his way, wondering what lay back of the night's adventure. He racked his brain for a hint as to the identity of the woman and the reason of her presence alone with Marsh in such a place. Again he thought of that mysterious third person whose movements had been so swift and furious, but his conjectures left him more at sea than ever. Of one thing he felt sure. It was not enmity alone that prompted Marsh to accuse him of the stabbing. The man was concealing something, in deadly fear of the truth, for rather than submit to questioning he had let his enemy go scot-free. Suddenly Boyd paused in his walk, recalling again the shadowy outlines of the figure with whom he had so nearly collided on his way up from the beach. There was something familiar about it, he mused. Then, with a low whistle of surprise, he smote his palms together. He began to see dimly. For more than an hour the young man paced back and forth before the door of his sleeping quarters, so deeply immersed in thought that only the breaking storm drove him within. When at last he retired, it was with the certainty that this night had placed a new weapon in his hand, but of what tremendous value it was destined to prove he little knew. End of chapter 21. Chapter 22 of The Silver Horde. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Michele Fry, Baton Rouge, Louisiana. The Silver Horde by Rex Beach. The Silver Horde. The main body of salmon struck the Kalvik River on the first day of July. For a week past the run had been slowly growing while the canneries tested themselves, but on the opening day of the new month the horde issued boldly forth from the depths of the sea, and the battle began in earnest. They came during the hush of the dawn, a mad, crowding throng from no man's land, to wake the tide rips and people the shimmering reaches of the bay, lashing them to sudden life and fury. Outside, the languorous ocean heaved as smiling and serene as ever, but within the harbor a wondrous change occurred. As if in answer to some deep-sea signal, the tides were quickened by a coursing multitude, steadfast and unafraid, yet foredoomed to die by the hand of man, or else more surely by the serving of their destiny. Clad in their argent mail of blue and green, they worked the bay to madness. They overwhelmed the waters, surging forward in great droves and columns, hesitating only long enough to frolic with the shifting currents, as if rejoicing in their strength and beauty. At times they swam with cleaving fins exposed. Again they churned the placid waters until swift combers raced across the shallow bars like tidal waves, while the deeper channels were shot through with shadowy forms or pierced by the lightning glint of silvered bellies. They streamed in with the flood tide to retreat again with the ebb, but there was neither haste nor caution in their progress. They had come in answer to the breeding call of the sea, and its exaltation was upon them, driving them relentlessly onward. They had no voice against its overmastering spell. Mustering in the early light like a swarm of giant white-winged moths, the fishing boats raced forth with the flowing tide, urged by sweep and sail and lusty sinews. Paying out their 100-fathom nets, they drifted over the banks like flocks of resting seagulls, only to come plowing back again, deep laden with their spoils. Grimy tugboats lay beside the traps, shrilling the air with creaking winches as they brailed the struggling fish, a half-ton at a time, from the pounds, now churning to milky foam by the ever-growing throng of prisoners, and all the time the big plants gulped the sea harvest faster and faster, clanking and gnashing their metal jaws, while the mounds of salmon lay hip-deep to the crews that fed the butchering machines. The time had come for man to take his toll. Now dawned a period of feverish activity wherein no one might rest short of actual exhaustion. Haste became the cry, and comfort fled. At Emerson's cannery there fell a sudden panic, for 50 fishermen quit. Returning from the banks on the night before the run started, they stacked their gear and notified Boyd Emerson of their determination. Then, despite his utmost efforts to dissuade them, they took their packs upon their shoulders and marched up the beach to Willis Marsh's plant. Larson, the day foreman, acted as their spokesman, and Boyd recognized, too late, the result of that conversation he had interrupted on the night of his visit to Cherry. This defection diminished his boat crew by more than half, and while the shoremen stoutly maintained their loyalty, the chance of putting up a pack seemed lost. Success or failure in the Bering Sea fisheries may depend upon the loss of a day. Emerson found himself facing a situation more desperate than any heretofore. Marsh had delayed the execution of his plans until the run had started, and there was no possibility of recruiting a new force. Alarmed beyond measure, Boyd swallowed his pride and went straightway to his enemy. He found Marsh well recovered from his flesh wound of a week or more before, yet extremely cautious for his safety, as he evidenced by conducting the interview before witnesses. "We are short-handed, and I gave instructions to secure every available man," he announced at the conclusion of Emerson's story. "It's not my fault if your men prefer to work for me." "Then you force me to retaliate," said Boyd. "I shall hire your men out from under you." Marsh laughed provokingly. "Try it. I am a good organizer, if nothing else. If you send emissaries to my plants, it will cause certain violence, and I think you had better avoid that, for we outnumber you 10 to 1. Stormy accusations and retorts followed, till Emerson left the place in helpless disgust. Nor had he hit upon any method of relief when Cherry came down to the plant on the following morning, though he and Big George had spent the night in conference. She lost no time in futile indignation, but inquired straightway, "What are you going to do about it? The fish have begun to run, and you can't afford to lose an hour." "I have sent a man to each of the other plants to hire fishermen at any price, but I have no hope that they will succeed. Marsh has his crews too well in hand for that." Cherry nodded. "They wouldn't dare quit him now. He'd never let them return to this country if they did. Meanwhile, the rest of your force is on the banks, I presume?" "Yes." "How many boats have you?" 10. "Heavens! And this is the first day of the run? It looks bad, doesn't it? Has the trap begun to fill?" "No, George is down there now. I guess Marsh succeeded in corking it. Meanwhile, all the other plants are working, while my chinks are playing fantail." Cherry gazed curiously at her companion to see how he accepted this latest shift in fortune. She knew that it spelled disaster, for a light catch, with the tremendous financial loss entailed, would not only mean difficulty with Hilliard's loan, but other complications impossible to forecast. Her mind sped onward to the effect of a failure upon Boyd's private affairs. He had told her in unmistakable terms that this was his last chance, the final hope upon which hung the realization of his dreams. In some way his power to hold Mildred Wayland was bound up with his financial success. If he should lose her, where would he turn? She asked herself, and something within her answered that he would look for consolation to the woman who had stood at his shoulder all these weary months. Sudden emotion swept over her at the thought. What cared she for his success or failure? He was the one man she had ever known, the mate for whom she had been molded. If this were his last chance, it promised to be the opportunity she had so long awaited. For once that other was out of her mind. Cherry felt that he would turn to her. She knew it intuitively, knew it from the light she had seen in his eyes that night at her house, knew it by the promptings of her own heart at this moment. She began to tremble, and felt her breast swelling with a glad determination. But he interrupted her flight of fancy with a sigh of such hopeless weariness that her pity rose instinctively. He gave her a sad little smile as he said, "I seem to bring misfortune upon every one connected with me, don't I? I'm afraid I am a poor sort." How boyish he was, the girl thought tenderly, yet how splendidly brave he had been throughout the fight. There was a voiceless maternal yearning in her heart as she asked him gravely, "If you fail now, it will mean the end of everything, will it not?" "Yes," he squared his tired shoulders, "but I am not beaten yet. You taught me never to give up, Cherry. If I have to go back home without a catch and see Hilliard take this plant over, why, I'll begin once more at something new, and some day I will succeed. But I shan't give up. I'll can what salmon we catch and then begin all over again next season." "And suppose you don't succeed? Suppose Hilliard won't carry you?" "Then I shall try something else. Maybe I shall go to mining again. I don't know. Anyhow, she would not let me grow disheartened if she were here. She wouldn't let me quit. She isn't that sort." Cherry Malotte stirred and shifted her gaze uncertainly to the gleaming bay. Abreast of them the fleet of fishing boats were drifting with the tide. In the distance others were dotted, clear away to where the opal ocean lay. A tug was passing, and she saw the sun flash from the cargo in its tow, while the faint echo of a song came wafting to her ears. She stood so for a long moment, fighting manfully with herself, then wheeled upon him suddenly. There was a new tone in her voice as she said, "If you will let me have one of your launches, I may be able to help you." "How?" he demanded quickly. "Never mind how. It's a long chance and hardly worth trying, but may I take the boat?" "Certainly," said he. "There's one lying at the dock." He led her to the shore and saw her aboard, then waved good-bye and walked moodily back to the office, gratified that she should try to help him, yet certain that she could not succeed where he and George had failed. Fingerless Fraser had breakfasted late, as was his luxurious custom, and shortly before noon, in the course of his dissatisfied meanderings, he found his friend in the office, lost in sombre thought. It was the first time in many weeks that he had seen this mood in Boyd, and after a fruitless effort to make him talk, he fell into his old habit of imaginary reading, droning away to himself as if from a printed page. "Your stay among us has not been very pleasant, has it?" Mr. Emerson inquired. "Not so you could notice it," replied our hero. "I don't like fish, and I never did." "That is the result of prejudice. The fish is a noble animal," Mr. Emerson declared. "He's not an animal at all," our hero gently corrected. "He's a biped, a regular wild biped without either love of home or affection for his children. A salmon is of a low order of intelligence, and has a Queen Anne slant to his roof. No person with a retreating forehead like that knows very much. The only other member of the animal kingdom that is as foolish as the salmon is Alton Clyde. The fish has got a shade the best of it over him, but as for friendship and the gentler emotions, why, the salmon hasn't got them at all. The only thing he's got is a million eggs and a sense of direction. If he had a spark of intelligence, he'd lay one egg a year like a hen, and thus live for a million years. But does he? Not on your Saroni. He's a spendthrift and turns his eggs loose, a hatful at a time. He's worse than a shotgun. And then, too, he's as clannish as a Harvard graduate and don't associate with nobody out of his own set. No, sir. Give me a warm-blooded animal that suckles its young. I'll take a farmer every time." "These are points I had never considered," said Mr. Emerson, "but every business has its drawbacks, you'll agree. If I have failed as a host, what can I do to entertain you while you grace our midst?" "You can do most anything," remarked his handsome companion, "or do anything except fish all the time." "But it is a dark night without, and I fear some mischief is afoot." "True, but yonder beauteous gel—" Roused by the familiarity of these lines, Emerson looked up from his preoccupation and smiled at Fraser's serious pantomime. "Am I as bad as all that?" he inquired with an effort at pleasantry. "You're worse, Bo. I guess you didn't know I was here, eh?" "No. By the way, what about that beauteous gel and the mischief that is afoot? What is the rest of the story?" "I don't know. I never got past that place. Say, if I had time, I bet I could write a good book. I've got plenty to say." "Why don't you give it a try?" "Too busy," yawned the adventurer lazily. "Gee, this is a lonesome burg. Kalvik is sure out in the tall grass, ain't it? I feel as if I'd like to break a pane of glass. Let's start something." "I don't find it particularly dull at the present moment." Boyd rose and began to pace the room. "Oh, I heard all about your trouble. I just left the pest house." "The what?" "The pest house. Clyde's joint. Ain't he a calamity?" "In what way?" "Is there any way in which he ain't?" "You don't like him, do you?" "No, I don't," declared Fingerless Fraser stoutly. "And what's more, I'm glad I don't like him, because if I liked him, I'd have to associate with him, and I hate him." "What's the matter?" "Well, I like silence and quietude. I'm a fool about my quiet. But Clyde," he paused as if in search for suitable expression. "Well, whenever I try to say anything, he interrupts me." After another pause he went on. "He's dead sore on this place, too, and whines around like a litter of pups. He says he was misled into coming up here, and has a hunch he's going to lose his bankroll." "Last night's episode frightened him, I dare say." "Yep, ever since he got that wallop on the burr in Seattle, a guinea pig could lick him hand to hand. You'd think that 10 thou he put up was all the wealth of the Incers." "The wealth of what?" "Incers. That's a tribe of rich Mexicans. However, I suppose I'd hang to my coin the same way he does if I had a mayonnaise head like his. He's an awful shine as a business man." "So he's homesick, eh?" "Sure. Offered to sell me his stock." Fraser threw back his head and gave vent to one of his rare laughs. "Ain't that a rave?" "Here he comes now," Boyd announced with a glance out the window, and the next instant Alton Clyde entered, a picture of dejection. "Gee, this is fierce, isn't it?" the clubman began, flinging himself into the nearest chair. "They tell me it's all off finally. What are you going to do?" "Put up what fish I can with a short crew," said Boyd. "We'll lose a lot of money." "Probably." Clyde's tone was querulous as he continued. "I'm sorry I ever went into this thing. You bet if I had known as much in Chicago as I know now, I would have hung on to my money and stayed at home." "You knew as much as we did," Boyd declared curtly. "Oh, it's all right for you to talk. You haven't risked any coin in the deal, but I'm a rotten business man, and I'll never make my ante back again if I lose it." "Don't whine about it," said Boyd stiffly. "You can at least be game and lose like a man." "Then we are going to lose, eh?" queried Clyde in a scared voice. "I thought maybe you had a plan." "Look here," he began an instant later. "Cherry pulled us out once before. Why don't we let her see what she can do with Marsh?" Boyd scanned the speaker's face sharply before speaking. "What do you mean by that?" "I mean she can work him if she tries, the same way she worked Hilliard." "Marsh isn't in the mood to listen to arguments. I have tried that." "Who said anything about arguments? You know what I mean." "I don't care to listen to that sort of talk." "Why not? I'm entitled to have my say in things." Clyde was growing indignant. "I put in 10,000 of my own money, and 25,000 besides, on your assurances. That's 35,000 more than you put up." "Nevertheless, it doesn't give you the right to insult the girl." "Insult her? Bah! You're no fool, Boyd. Why did Hilliard advance that loan?" "Because he wanted to, I dare say." "What's the use of keeping that up? You know as well as I do that she worked him, and worked him well. She'd do it again if you asked her. She'd do anything for you." Boyd broke out roughly. "I tell you, I've heard enough of that talk, Alton. Anybody but an idiot would know that Cherry is far too good for what you suggest. And when you insult her, you insult me." "Oh, she's good enough," said Claude. "They're all good, but not perhaps in the way you mean." "How do you know?" "I don't know, but Fraser does. He's known her for years, haven't you, Fraser?" But the adventurer's face was like wood as they turned toward him. "I don't know nothing," replied Fingerless Fraser, with an admirable show of ignorance. "Well, judge for yourself." Clyde turned again to Emerson. "Who is she? Where did she come from? What is she doing here alone? Answer that. Now, she's interested in this deal just as much as any of us, and if you don't ask her to take a hand, I'm going to put it up to her myself." "You'll do nothing of the sort," Boyd cried savagely. Clyde rose hastily, and his voice was shaking with excitement as he stammered. "See here, Boyd, you're to blame for this trouble, and now you either get us out of it or buy my stock." "You know that I can't buy your stock." "Then I'll sell it wherever I can. I've been stung, and I want my money. Only remember, I offered the stock to you first." "You've got a swell chance to make a turn in Kalvik," said Fraser. "Why don't you take it to Marsh?" "I will," declared Alton. "You wouldn't do a trick like that?" Emerson questioned, quickly. "Why not? You won't listen to my advice. You're playing with other people's money, and it doesn't matter to you whether you win or lose. If this enterprise fails, I suppose you can promote another." "Get out!" Boyd ordered in such a tone that the speaker obeyed with ludicrous haste. Fingerless Fraser broke the silence that fell upon the young man's exit. "He's a nice little feller. I never knew one of those narrow-chested 5 o'clock tea drinkers that was on the level. He's got 18 fancy vests, and wears a handkerchief up his sleeve. That put him in the end book with me to start with." "Did you know Cherry before you came to Kalvik?" Boyd asked, searching his companion's face with a look the man could not evade. "Only casual." "Where?" "Nome, the year of the big rush." "During the mining troubles, eh?" "Sure." "What was she doing?" "Minding her business. She's good at that." Fraser's eyes had become green and fishy, as usual. "What do you know about her?" "Well, I know that a lot of fellows would go through for her at the drop of a hat. She could have most anything they've got, I guess. Most of them miners at Nome would give his right eye or his only child, or any little thing like that, if she asked it." "What else?" "Well, she was always considered a right good-looking party." "Yes, yes, of course. But what do you know about the girl herself? Who is she? What is her history?" "Now, sir, I'm an awful poor detective," confessed Fingerless Fraser. "I've often noticed that about myself. If I was the kind that goes snooping around into other people's business, listening to all the gossip I'm told, I'd make a good witness. But I ain't. No, sir, I am a rotten witness." Despite this indirect rebuke, Boyd might have continued his questioning had not George Balt's heavy step sounded outside. A moment later the big fellow entered. "What did you find at the traps?" asked Emerson eagerly. "Nothing." George spoke shortly. "The fish struck in this morning, but our trap is corked." He wrenched off his rubber boots and flung them savagely under the bench. "What luck with the boats?" "Not much. Marsh's men are trying to surround our gill netters, and we ain't got enough boats to protect ourselves." He looked up meaningly from under his heavy brows and inquired, "How much longer are we going to stand for this?" "What do you mean? I've got men out hunting for new hands." "You know what I mean," the giant rumbled, his red eyes flaming. You and I can get Willis Marsh." Emerson shot a quick glance at Fraser, who was staring fixedly at Big George. "He's got us right enough, and it's bound to come to a killing some day, so the sooner the better," the fisherman ran on. "We can get him tonight if you say so. Are you in on it?" Boyd faced the window slowly, while the others followed him with anxious eyes. Inside the room a death-like silence settled. In the distance they heard the sound of the canning machinery, a sound that was now a mockery. To Balt, this last disaster was the culmination of a persecution so pitiless and unflagging that its very memory filled his simple mind with the fury of a goaded animal. To his companion it meant, almost certainly, the loss of Mildred Wayland, the girl who stood for his pride in himself and all that he held most desirable. He thought bitterly of all the suffering and hardship, the hunger of body and soul, that he had endured for her sake. Again he saw his hopes crumbling and his dreams about to fade. Once more he felt his foothold giving way beneath him, as it had done so often in the past, and he was filled with sullen hate. Something told him that he would never have the heart to try again, and the thought left him cold with rage. Ever since those fishermen had walked out on the evening before, he had clung to the feeble hope that once the run began in earnest, George's trap would fill and save the situation. But now that the salmon had struck in and the trap was useless, his discouragement was complete, for there were no idle men in Kalvik, and there was no way of getting help. Moreover, Mildred Wayland was soon to arrive, the yacht was expected daily, and she would find him a failure. What was worse, she would find that Marsh had vanquished him. She had kept her faith in him, he reflected, but a woman's faith could hardly survive humiliation, and it was not in human nature to lean forever upon a broken reed. She would turn elsewhere, perhaps to the very man who had contrived his undoing. At thought of this, a sort of desperation seemed to master him, and he began to mutter aloud. "What did you say?" queried Balt. "I said that you are right. The time is close at hand for some sort of a reckoning," answered Boyd, in a harsh, strained voice. "Good!" Emerson was on the point of turning when his eyes fell upon a picture that made him start, then gaze more intently. Out upon the placid waters, abreast of the Plant, the launch in which Cherry had departed was approaching, and it was loaded down with men. Not only were they crowded upon the craft itself, but trailing behind it, like the tail of a kite, was a long line of canoes, and these also were peopled. "Look yonder!" cried Boyd. "What?" "Cherry has got a crew." His voice broke, and he bolted toward the door as Big George leaped to the window. "Injuns, by God!" shouted the giant, and without stopping to stamp his feet into his boots, he rushed out barefoot after Boyd and Fraser. Together the three men reached the dock in time to help Cherry up the ladder. "What does this mean?" Boyd asked her breathlessly. "Will these fellows work?" "That's what they're here for," said the girl. After her swarmed a crowd of slant-eyed, copper-hued Aleuts. Those in the kayaks astern cast off and paddled toward the beach. "I've got 50 men, the best on the river. I tried to get more, but there aren't any more." Fingerless Fraser slapped himself resoundingly upon the thigh and exploded profanely. Boyd seized the girl's hands in his and wrung them. "Cherry, you're a treasure." The memory of his desperate resolution of a moment before swept over him suddenly, and his voice trembled with a great thankfulness. "Don't thank me," Cherry exclaimed. "It was more Constantine's work than mine." "But I don't understand. These are Marsh's men." "To be sure. But I was good to them when they were hungry last winter, and I prevailed upon them to come. They aren't very good fishermen. They're awfully lazy, and they won't work half as hard as white men, but it's the best I could do." She laughed gladly, more than repaid by the look in her companion's face. "Now get me some lunch. I'm fairly starved." Big George, when he had fully grasped the situation, became the boss fisherman on the instant. Before the others had reached the cookhouse he was busied in laying out his crews and distributing his gear. The impossible had happened. Victory was in sight. The fish were running. He cared to know no more. That night the floors of the fish dock groaned beneath the weight of silver-sided salmon piled waist-high to a tall man. All through the cool, dim-lit hours the ranks of Chinese butchers hacked and slit and slashed with swift, sure, tireless strokes, while the great building echoed hollowly to the clank of machines and the hissing sighs of the soldering furnaces. End of chapter 22.
Chapter 23 of the Silver Horde. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Silver Horde by Rex Beach. Chapter 23, in which more plans are laid. It seemed to Boyd that he had never felt such elation as during the days that followed. He trod upon air. His head was in the clouds. He joked with his men, inspiring them with his own good humor and untiring energy. He was never idle, save during the odd hours that he snatched for sleep. He covered the plant from top to bottom, and no wheel stopped turning, no mechanical device gave way without his instant attention. So urgent was he that George Balt became desperate, for the Indians were not like white men, and proved a sad trial to the big fellow, who was accustomed to drive his crews with the cruelty of a convict foreman. Despite his utmost endeavors, he could not keep the plant running to capacity, and in his zeal he took the blame wholly upon himself. While the daily output was disappointing, Emerson drew consolation from the prospect that his pack would be large enough at least to avert utter ruin, and he argued that once he had won through his first season, no power that Marsh could bring to bear would serve to crush him. He saw a moderate success ahead, if not the overwhelming victory upon which he had counted. Up at the Trust's headquarters, Willis Marsh was in a fine fury. As far as possible, his subordinates avoided him. His superintendents, summoned from their work, emerged from the red-painted office on the hill with dampened brows and frightened glances over their shoulders. Many of them held their places through services that did not show upon the company's books, but now they shook their heads and swore that some things were beyond them. Except for one step on Emerson's part, Marsh would have rested secure and let time work out his enemy's downfall. But Boyd's precaution in contracting to sell his output in advance threatened to defeat him. Otherwise, Marsh would simply have cut down his rival's catch to the lowest point and then broken the market in the fall. With the Trust's tremendous resources back of him, he could have afforded to hammer down the price of fish to a point where Emerson would either have been ruined or forced to carry his pack for a year, and in this course he would have been upheld by Wayne Wayland. But as matters stood, such tactics could only result in a serious loss to the brokers who had agreed to take Boyd's catch, and to the Trust itself. It was therefore necessary to work the young man's undoings here and now. Marsh knew that he had already wasted too much time in Kalvik, for he was needed at other points far to the southward, but he could not bear to leave this fight to other hands. Moreover, he was anxiously awaiting the arrival of the Grande with Mildred and her father. One square of the calendar over his desk was marked in red, and the sight of it gave him fresh determination. On the third day after Boyd's deliverance, Constantine sought him out, in company with several of the native fishermen, translating their demands to be paid for the fish they had caught. "Can't they wait until the end of the week?" Emerson inquired. "No, they got no money. They got no grub. They say little baby is hungry, and they like money now. So soon they buy grub, they work some more." "Very well. Here's an order on the bookkeeper." Boyd tore a leaf from his notebook and wrote a few words on it, telling the men to present it at the office. As Constantine was about to leave, he called to him, "Wait, I want to talk with you." The breed halted. How long have you known Mr. Marsh?" "Me know him long time." "Do you like him?" A flicker ran over the fellow's coppery face as he replied, "Yes, him good man." "You used to work for him, did you not?" "Yes." "Why did you quit?" Constantine hesitated slightly before answering. "Me go work for Cherry." "Why?" "She good to my little brother. You savvy little children, so big." "Yes, I've seen him. He's a fine little fellow. By the way, do you remember the night about 2 weeks ago when I was at Cherry's house? The night you and your sister went out?" "I 'member." "Where did you go?" Constantine shifted his walrus-soled boots. "What for you ask?" "Never mind. Where did you go when you left the house?" "Me go Indian village. What for you ask?" "Nothing. Only, if you ever have any trouble with Mr. Marsh, I may be able to help you. I like you, and I don't like him." The breed grunted unintelligibly and was about to leave when Boyd reached forth suddenly and plucked the fellow's sheath knife from its scabbard. With a startled cry, Constantine whirled, his face convulsed, his nostrils dilated like those of a frightened horse, but Emerson merely fingered the weapon carelessly, remarking, "That is a curious knife you have. I have noticed it several times." He eyed him shrewdly for a moment, then handed the blade back with a smile. Constantine slipped it into its place and strode away without a word. It was considerably later in the day when Boyd discovered the Indians to whom he had given the note talking excitedly on the dock. Seeing Constantine in argument with them, he approached to demand an explanation, whereupon the quarter breed held out a silver dollar in his palm with the words, "These men say this money no good." "What do you mean?" "It's no good. No can buy grub at company store." Boyd saw that the group was eyeing him suspiciously. "Nonsense. What's the matter with it?" "Storekeeper laugh and say it come from you. He say take it back. He no sell my people any flour." It was evident that even Constantine was vaguely distrustful. Another native extended a coin, saying, "We want money like this." Boyd took the piece and examined it, whereupon a light broke upon him. The coin was stamped with the initials of one of the old fishing companies, and he instantly recognized a ruse practiced in the North during the days of the first trading concerns. It had been the custom of these companies to pay their Indians in coins, bearing their own impress, and to refuse all other specie at their posts, thus compelling the natives to trade at company stores. By carefully building up this system, they had obtained a monopoly of Indian labor, and it was evident that Marsh and his associates had robbed the Aleuts in the same manner during the days before the consolidation. Boyd saw at once the cause of the difficulty and undertook to explain it, but he had small success, for the Indians had learned a hard lesson and were loath to put confidence in the white man's promises. Seeing that his words carried no conviction, Emerson gave up at last, saying, "If the company store won't take this money, I'll sell you whatever you need from the commissary. We are not going to have any trouble over a little thing like this." He marched the natives in a body to the storehouse, where he saw to it that they received what provisions they needed and assisted them in loading their canoes. But his amusement at the episode gave way to uneasiness on the following morning when the Aleuts failed to report for work, and by noon his anxiety resolved itself into strong suspicion. Balt had returned from the banks earlier in the morning with news of a struggle between his white crews and Marsh's men. George's boats had been surrounded during the night, nets had been cut, and several encounters had occurred, resulting in serious injury to his men. The giant, in no amiable mood, had returned for reinforcements, stating that the situation was becoming more serious every hour. Hearing of the desertion of the natives, he burst into profanity, then armed himself and returned to the banks, while Boyd, now thoroughly alarmed, took a launch and sped up the river to Cherry's house. in the hope that she could prevail upon her own recruits to return. He found the girl ready to accompany him, and they were about to embark when Chakawana came running from the house as if in sudden fright. "Where you go?" she asked her mistress. "I'm going to the Indian village. You stay here." "No, no, I no stop here alone. I go long too." She cast a glance over her shoulder. "But Chakawana, what is the matter? Are you afraid?" "Yes," Chakawana nodded, her pretty head vigorously. "What are you afraid of?" Boyd asked, but she merely stared at him with eyes as black and round as ox-heart cherries, then renewed her entreaty. When she had received permission and had hurried back to the house, her mistress remarked, with a puzzled frown, "I don't know what to make of her. She and Constantine have been acting very strangely of late. She used to be the happiest sort of creature, always laughing and singing, but she has changed entirely during the last few weeks. Both she and Constantine are forever whispering to each other and skulking about, until I am getting nervous myself." Then, as the Indian girl came flying back with her tiny baby brother in her arms, Cherry added, "She's pretty, isn't she? I can't bear ugly people around me." At the native village, in spite of every effort she and Boyd could make, the Indians refused to go back to work. Many of them, so they learned, had already reported to other canneries, evidently still doubtful of Emerson's assurances and afraid to run the risk of offending their old employers. Those who left were lazy fellows who did not care to work under any circumstances. These merely listened, then shrugged their shoulders and walked away. "Since they can't use your money at the store, they don't seem to care whether it's good or not," Cherry announced after a time. "I'll give them enough provisions to last them all winter," Boyd offered, irritated beyond measure at such stupidity. "Tell them to move the whole blamed village down to my place, women and all. I'll take care of them." But after an hour of futile cajolery, he was forced to give up, realizing that Marsh had been at work again, frightening these simple people by threats of vengeance and starvation. You can't blame the poor things. They have learned to fear the hand of the companies and to know that they are absolutely dependent upon the cannery stores during the winter. But it's maddening. She stamped her foot angrily. And I was so proud of my work. I thought I had really done something to help at last. But I don't know what more we can do. I've reached the end of my rope. "So have I," he confessed. "Even with those 50 Aleuts, we weren't running at more than half capacity. But we were making a showing at least. Now..." He flung up his hands in a gesture of despair. "George is in trouble, as usual. Marsh's men have cut our nets, and the yacht may arrive at any time." "The yacht? What yacht?" "Mr. Whalen's yacht. He is making a tour of this coast with the other officers of the Trust, and Mildred." Is she coming here?" demanded Cherry in a strained voice. "Yes." "Why didn't you tell me?" "I don't know. I didn't think you would be interested." "So she can't wait. She is so eager that she follows you from Chicago clear up into this wilderness. Then you won't need my assistance any more, will you?" Her lids drooped, half hiding her eyes, and her face hardened. "Of course I shall need your help. Her coming won't make any difference." "It strikes me that you have allowed me to make a fool of myself long enough," said Cherry angrily. "Here I have been breaking my heart over this enterprise, while you have known all the time that she was coming. Why, you have merely used me, and George, and all the rest of us, for that matter." She laughed harshly. "You don't understand," said Boyd. "Miss Wayland..." "Oh, yes, I do. I dare say it will gratify her to straighten out your troubles. A word from her lips, and your worries will vanish like a mist. Let us acknowledge ourselves beaten and beg her to save us." Boyd shook his head in negation, but she gave him no time for speech. "It seems you wanted to pose as hero before her, and employed us to build up your triumph. Well, I'm glad we failed. I'm glad Willis Marsh showed you how very helpless you are. Let her come to your rescue now. I'm through. Do you understand? I'm through." Emerson gazed at her in astonishment. The outburst had been so unexpected, but he realized that he owed her too much to take offense. "Miss Whalen will take no hand in my affairs. I doubt if she will even realize what this trouble is all about," he said a trifle stiffly. "I suppose I did want to play the hero, and I dare say I did use you and the others, but you knew that all the time." "Why won't she help you?" queried Cherry. "Doesn't she care enough about you? Doesn't she know enough to understand your plight?" "Yes, but this is my fight, and I've got to make good without her assistance. She isn't the sort to marry a failure, and she has left me to make my own way. Besides, she would not dare go contrary to her father's wishes, even if she desired. That is part of her education. Oh, Wayne Whaling's opposition isn't all I have to overcome. I have to show his daughter that I am one of her kind, for she hates weakness." "And you think that woman loves you? Why, she isn't a woman at all. She doesn't know what love means. When a woman loves, do you imagine she cares for money or fame or success? If I cared for a man, do you think I'd stop to ask my father if I might marry him, or wait for my lover to prove himself worthy of me? Do you think I'd send him through the hell you've suffered to try his mettle?" She laughed outright. "Why, I'd become what he was, and I'd fight with him. I'd give him all I had, money, position, friends, influence. If my people objected, I'd tell them to go hang. I'd give them up and join him. I'd use every dollar, every wile and feminine device that I possessed in his service. When a woman loves, she doesn't care what the world says. The man may be a weakling or worse, but he is still her lover, and she will go to him." The words had come tumbling forth until Cherry was forced to pause for breath. "You don't understand," said Boyd. "You are primitive. You have lived in the open. She is exactly your opposite. Conservatism is bred in her, and she can't help her nature. It was hard even for me to understand at first, but when I saw her life, when I saw how she had been reared from childhood, I understood perfectly. I would not have her other than she is. It is enough for me to know that in her own way she cares for me." Cherry tossed her head in derision. "For my part, I prefer red blood to sap, and when I love I want to know it. I don't want to have it proved to me like a problem in geometry. I want to love and hate and do wild, impulsive things against my own judgment." "Have you ever loved in that way?" he inquired abruptly. "Yes," she answered without hesitation, looking him squarely in the eye with an expression he could not fathom. "Thank heaven, I'm not the artificial kind. As you say, I'm primitive. I have lived." Her crimson lips curled scornfully. "I didn't expect you to understand her," he said. "But she loves me, and well, she's my religion. A man must have some god. He can't worship his own image." Cherry Malotte turned slowly to the landing place and made her way into the launch. All the way back she kept silence, and Boyd, confused by her attack upon the citadel of his faith and strangely sore at heart, made no effort at speech. Fingerless Fraser met him at the water's edge. "Where in the devil have you been?" he cried breathlessly. "At the Indian village after help. Why?" "Big George is in more trouble. He sent for help 2 hours ago. I was just going to beat it down there." "What's up?" "There's 6 of your men in the bunkhouse all beat up. They don't look like they'd fish any more for a while. Marsh's men threw their salmon overboard, and they had another fight. Things are getting warm." "We can't allow ourselves to be driven from the bank," said Boyd quickly. "I'll get the shoremen together right away. Find Alton and bring him along. We'll need every man we can get." "Nothing doing with that party. He's quit like a house cat and gone to bed." "Very well. He's no good anyhow. He's better out of the way." He hurried through the building, now silent and half deserted, gathering a crew. Then, leaving only Orientals and the watchman to guard the plant, he loaded his men into the boats and set out. All that afternoon and on through the long, murky hours of the night, the battle raged over the lower reaches of the Kalvik. Boat crews clashed, Half-clad men cursed each other and fought with naked fists, with oars, and with clubs, and when these failed, they drove at one another with wicked, one-tined fish-pews. All night the hordes of salmon swarmed upward toward the fatal waters of their birth, through sagging nets that were torn and slit, beneath keels that rocked to the impact of struggling, heedless bodies. End of chapter 23. Recording by Richard Kilmer, Rio Medina, Texas. Chapter 24 of the Silver Horde. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Silver Horde by Rex Beach. Chapter 24, Wherein the Grande arrives, laden with disappointments. As the sun slanted up between the southward hills, out from the gossamer haze that lay like a filmy frost smoke above the ocean, came a snow-white yacht. She stole inward past the headlands, as silent as a wraith, leaving a long black streamer penciled against the sky. So still was the dawn that the breath from her funnel lay like a trail behind her, slowly fading and blending with the colors of the morning. The waters were gleaming nickel beneath her prow, and she clove them like a blade. Against the dove-gray sky her slender rigging was traced as by some finely pointed instrument. Her sides were as clean as the stainless breasts of the gulls that floated near the shore. As she came proudly up through the fleets of fishing boats, perfect in every line, and gliding with stately dignity, the grimy little crafts drew aside as if in awe, while tired-eyed men stared silently at her as if at a vision. To Boyd Emerson she seemed like an angel of mercy, and he stood forth upon the deck of his launch, searching her hungrily for the sight of a woman's figure. When he had first seen the ship rounding the point, he had uttered a cry, then fallen silent, watching her as she drew near, heedless of his surroundings. His heart was leaping. His breath was choking him. It seemed as if he must shout Mildred's name aloud and stretch his arms out to her. Of course she would see him as the Grande passed. She would be looking for him, he knew. She would be standing there, wet with the dew, searching with all her eyes. Doubtless she had waited patiently at her post for the instant land came into sight. Seized by a sudden panic, lest she pass him unnoticed, he ordered his launch near the yacht's course, where he could command a view of her cabin doors and the wicker chairs upon her deck. His eyes roved over the craft, but all he saw was a uniformed officer upon the bridge and the bronzed faces of the watch staring over the rail. By now the Grande was so close that he might have flung a line to her, and above the muffled throbbing of her engines he heard the captain give some low-spoken command. Yet nowhere could he catch a glimpse of Mildred. He saw close-drawn curtains over the cabin windows, indicating that the passengers were still asleep. Then, as he stood there, heavy-hearted, drooping with fatigue, his wet body chilled by the morning's breath, the Grande glided past, and he found the shell beneath his feet rocking in her wake. As he turned shoreward, George Balt hailed him and brought his own launch alongside. "What craft is that?" he inquired. "She is the company's yacht, with the NAPA officers aboard." The big fellow stared curiously after the retreating ship. "Some of our boys is hurt pretty bad," he observed. "I've told them to take in their nets and go back to the plant." "We all need breakfast." "I don't want nothing. I'm going over to the trap." Emerson shrugged his shoulders listlessly. He was very tired. "What is the use? It won't pay us to lift it." "I've watched that point of land for 5 years, and I've never seen fish act this way before," Balt growled stubbornly. "If they don't strike in today, we'd better close down. Marsh's men cut half our nets, and crippled more than half our crew last night." He began to rumble curses. "Say, we made a mistake the other day, didn't we? We ought to have put that fellow away. It ain't too late yet." "Wait. Wherein is aboard that yacht. I know him. He's a hard man, and I've heard strange stories about him. But I don't believe he knows all that Marsh has been doing. I'm going to see him and tell him everything." "Suppose he turns you down?" "There will be time enough to consider what you suggest. I don't like to think about it." "You don't have to," said Balt, lowering his voice so that the helmsman could not hear. "I've been thinking it over all night, and it looks like I ought to do it myself. Marsh is coming to me anyhow, and I'm older than you be. It ain't right for a young fellow like you to take a chance. If they get me, you can run the business alone." Boyd laid his hand on his companion's shoulder. "No," he said. "Perhaps I won't stick at murder. I don't know. But I won't profit by another man's crime, and if it comes to that, I'll take my share of the risk and the guilt. Whatever you do, I'll stand with you, but we'll hope for better things. It's no easy thing for me to go to Mr. Wayland asking for a favor. You see, his daughter is, well, I want to see her very badly." Balt eyed him shrewdly. "I see. And that makes it dead wrong for you to take a hand. If it's necessary to get Marsh, I'll do it alone. With him out of the way, I think you can make a go of it. He's like a rattler. Somebody's got to stomp on him. Now I'm off for the trap. Let me know what the old man says." Boyd returned to the cannery with the old mood of self-disgust and bitterness heavy upon him. He realized that George's offer to commit murder had not shocked him as much as upon its first mention. He knew that he had thought of shedding human blood with as little compunction as if the intended victim had been some noxious animal. He felt, indeed, that if his love for Mildred made him a criminal, she too would be soiled by his dishonor, and for her sake he shrank from the idea of violence. Yet he lacked the energy at that time to put it from him. Well, he would go to her father, humble himself, and beg for protection. If he failed, then Marsh must look out for himself. He could not find it in his heart to spare his enemy. At the plant, he found Alton Clyde tremendously excited at the arrival of the yacht, and eager to visit his friends. He sent him to the launch, and after a hasty breakfast, joined him. On their way out, Boyd felt a return of that misgiving which had mastered him on his first meeting with Mildred in Chicago. For the second time, he was bringing her failure instead of the promised victory. Now, as then, she would find in him the bitterness of defeat, and he could not but wonder how she would bear the disappointment. He hoped at least that she would understand his appeal to her father, that she would see him not as a supplicant begging for mercy, but as a foeman worthy of respect, demanding his just dues. Surely he had proved himself capable. Wayland could hardly make him contemptible in Mildred's eyes. Yet a feeling of disquiet came over him as he drew near the Grande Dame. Willis Marsh was ahead of him, standing with Mr. Wayland at the rail. Someone else was with them. Boyd's heart leaped wildly as he recognized her. He would have known that slim figure anywhere. And Mildred saw him too, pointed him out to her companions. With knees shaking under him, he came stumbling up the landing ladder, a tall, gaunt figure of a man in rough clothing and boots stained with the sea salt. He looked older by 5 years than when the girl had last seen him. His cheeks were hollowed and his lips cracked by the wind, but his eyes were aflame with the old light. His smile was for her alone. He never remembered the spoken greetings nor the looks the others gave him, for her soft, cool hands lay in his hard, feverish palms, and she was smiling up at him. Alton Clyde was at his heels, and he felt Mildred disengage her hand. He tore his eyes away from her face long enough to nod at Marsh, who gave him a menacing look, then turned to Wayland. The old man was saying something, and Boyd answered him unintelligibly, after which he took Mildred's hand once more with such an air of unconscious proprietorship that Willis Marsh grew pale to the lips and turned his back. Other people, whom Boyd had not noticed until now, came down the deck, men and women with field glasses and cameras swung over their shoulders. He found that he was being introduced to them by Mildred, whose voice betrayed no tremor, and whose manners were as collected as if this were her own drawing-room, and the man at her side a casual acquaintance. The strangers mingled with the little group, leveled their glasses, and made senseless remarks after the manner of tourists the world over. Boyd gathered somehow that they were officers of the trust, or heavy stockholders, and their wives. They seemed to accept him as an uninteresting bit of local color, and he regarded them with equal indifference, for his eyes were wholly occupied with Mildred, his ears deaf to all but her voice. At length he saw some of them going over the rail, and later found himself alone with his sweetheart. He led her to a deck chair and seated himself beside her. At last he breathed, "You are here, Mildred. You really came, after all." "Yes, Boyd." "Are you glad?" "Indeed I am. The trip has been wonderful." "It doesn't seem possible. I can't believe that this is really you, and that I am not dreaming, as usual." "And you? How have you been?" "I've been well, I guess. I haven't had time to think of myself. Oh, my lady." His voice broke with tenderness, and he laid his hand gently upon hers. She withdrew it quickly. "Not here. Remember where we are. You are not looking well, Boyd. I don't know that I ever saw you look so badly. Perhaps it is your clothes." "I am tired," he confessed, feeling anew the weariness of the past 24 hours. He covertly stroked the fold of her dress, murmuring, "You are here, after all. And you love me, Mildred? You haven't changed, have you?" "Not at all. Have you?" His deep breath and the light that flamed into his face was her answer. "I want to be alone with you," he cried huskily. "My arms ache for you. Come away from here. This is torture. I'm like a man dying of thirst." No woman could have beheld his burning eagerness without an answering thrill, and although Mildred sat motionless, her lids drooped slightly, and a faint color tinged her cheeks. Her idle hands clasped themselves rigidly. "You are always the same," she smiled. "You sweep me away from myself and from everything. I have never seen anyone like you. There are people everywhere. Father is somewhere close by." "I don't care." "I do. My launch is alongside. Let me take you ashore and show you what I have done. I want you to see." "I can't. I promised to go ashore with the Berrys and Mr. Marsh." "Marsh?" "Now don't get tragic. We are all going to look over his plant and have lunch there. They are expecting me." "Oh, dear," she cried plaintively. "I have seen and heard nothing but canneries ever since we left Vancouver. The men talk of nothing but fish and packs and markets and dividends. It's all deadly stupid, and I'm wretchedly tired of it. Father is the worst of the lot, of course." Emerson's eyes shifted to his own cannery. "You haven't seen mine, ours," said he. "Oh, yes, I have. Mr. Marsh pointed it out to Father and me. It looks just like all the others." There was an instant's pause before she ran on. "Do you know, there is only one interesting feature about them, to my notion, and that is the way the Chinamen smoke. Those funny, crooked pipes and those little wads of tobacco are too ridiculous." The lightness of her words dampened his ardor and brought back the sense of failure. That formless huddle of buildings in the distance seemed to him all at once very dull and prosaic. Of course, it was just like scores of others that his sweetheart had seen all the way north from the border line. He had never thought of that till now. "I was down with the fishing fleet at the mouth of the bay this morning. When you came in, I thought I might see you," he said. "At that hour? Heavens, I was sound asleep." It was hard enough to get up when we were called. Father might have instructed the captain not to steam so fast." Boyd stared at her in hurt surprise, but she was smiling at Alton Clyde in the distance and did not observe his look. "Don't you care even to hear what I have done?" he inquired. "Of course," said Mildred, bringing her eyes back to him. Hesitatingly, he told her of his disappointments, the obstacles he had met and overcome, avoiding Marsh's name and refraining from placing the blame where it belonged. When he had concluded, she shook her head. "It's too bad, but Mr. Marsh told us all about it before you came. Boyd, I never thought well of this enterprise. Of course I didn't say anything against it. You were so enthusiastic. But you really ought to try something big. I am sure you have the ability. Why, the successful men I know at home have no more intelligence than you, and they haven't half your force. As for this, well, I think you can accomplish more important things than catching fish." "Important?" he cried. "Why, the salmon industry is one of the most important on the coast. It employs 10,000 men in Alaska alone, and they produce $10 million a year." "Oh, let's not go into statistics," said Mildred lightly. "They make my head ache. What I mean is that a fisherman is nothing like an attorney or a broker or an architect, for instance. He is more like a miner. Pardon me, Boyd, but look at your clothes." She began to laugh. "Why, you look like a common laborer." He became conscious for the first time that he cut a sorry figure. Everything around him spoke of wealth and luxury. Even the sailors that passed at the moment were better dressed than he. He felt suddenly awkward and out of place. "I might have slicked up a bit," he acknowledged lamely. "But when you came, I forgot everything else. I was dreadfully embarrassed when I introduced you to the Berrys and the rest. I dare say they thought you were one of Mr. Marsh's foremen." Never before had Boyd known the least constraint in Mildred's presence, but now he felt the rebuke behind her careless manner, and it wounded him deeply. He did not speak, and after a moment she went on with an abrupt change of subject. "So that funny little house over there against the hill is where the mysterious woman lives?" "Who?" "Cherry Malotte." "Yes, how did you learn that?" "Mr. Marsh pointed it out. He said that she came up on the same ship with you." "That is true." "Why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you write me that she was with you in Seattle?" "I don't know. I didn't think of it." She regarded him coolly. "Has anybody discovered who or what she is?" "Why are you so curious about her?" Mildred shrugged her shoulders. "Your discussion with Willis Marsh that night at our house interested me very much. I thought I would ask Mr. Marsh to bring her around when we went ashore. It would be rather amusing. She wouldn't come out to the yacht and return my call, would she?" Boyd smiled at her frank concern at this possibility. "You don't know the kind of girl she is," he said. "She isn't at all what you think. I don't believe you would be able to meet her in the way you suggest." "Indeed." Mildred arched her brows. "Why?" "She wouldn't fancy being brought around, particularly by Marsh." From her look of surprise he knew that he had touched on dangerous ground, and he made haste to lead the conversation back to its former channel. He wished to impress Mildred with the fact that if he had not quite succeeded, he had by no means failed. But she listened indifferently, with the air of humoring an insistent child. "I wish you would give it up and try something else," she said at last. "This is no place for you. Why, you are losing all your old wit and buoyancy. You are actually growing serious, and serious people are not at all amusing." Just then Alton Clyde and a group of people, among whom was Willis Marsh, emerged from the cabin, talking and laughing. Mildred arose, saying, "Here comes the Berrys, ready to go ashore." "When may I see you again?" he inquired quickly. "You may come out this evening." His eyes blazed as he answered, "I shall come." As the others came up, she said, "Mr. Emerson can't accompany us. He wishes to see Father." "I just left him in the cabin," said Marsh. He helped the ladies to the ladder, and a moment later Emerson waved the party adieu, then turned to the salon in search of Wayne Wayland. In Mr. Wayland's stiff greeting there was no hint that the two men had ever been friendly, but Emerson was prepared for coolness and seated himself without waiting for an invitation, glad of the chance to rest his tired limbs. He could not refrain from comparing these splendid quarters with his own bare living shack. The big carved desk, the heavy leather chairs, the amply fitted sideboard, seemed magnificent by contrast. His eyes roved over the walls with their bookshelves and rare paintings, and between velour hangings he caught a glimpse of a bedroom all in cool white enamel. The unaccustomed feel of the velvet carpet was grateful to his feet. He coveted the soft bed in yonder with its smooth linen. For all these things he felt the savage hunger that comes from deprivation and hardship. Mr. Wayland had removed his glasses and was waiting grimly. "I have a good deal to say to you, sir," Emerson began, "and I would like you to hear me through." "Go ahead." "I'm going to tell you some things about Mr. Marsh that I dare say you will disbelieve, but I can verify my statements. I think you are a just man, and I don't believe you know or would approve the methods he has used against me. If this is to be an arraignment against Mr. Marsh, I suggest you wait until he can be present. He has gone ashore with the women folk." "I prefer to talk to you first. We can call him in later if you wish." "Before we begin, may I inquire what you expect of me?" "I expect relief." "You remember our agreement?" "I don't want assistance. I want relief." "Whatever the distinction in the words, I understand that you are asking a favor." "I don't consider it so." "Very well. Proceed." "When you sent me out 3 years ago to make my fortune for Mildred, it was understood that there should be fair play on both sides." "Have you played fair?" quickly interposed the old man. "I have. When I came to Chicago, I had no idea that you were interested in the Pacific Coast fisheries. I had raised the money before I discovered that you even knew Willis Marsh. Then it was too late to retreat. When I reached Seattle, all sorts of unexpected obstacles came up. I lost the ship I had chartered. Machinery houses refused deliveries. Shipments went astray. My bank finally refused its loan, and every other bank in the Northwest followed suit. I was harassed in every possible way, and it wasn't chance that caused it. It was Willis Marsh. He set spies upon me. He incited a dock strike that resulted in a riot and the death of at least one man. Moreover, he tried to have me killed." "How do you know he did that?" "I have no legal proof, but I know it just the same." Mr. Wayland smiled. "That is not a very definite charge. You surely don't hold him responsible for the death of that striker?" "I do, and for the action of the police in trying to fix the crime upon me. You know, perhaps, how I got away from Seattle. When Marsh arrived at Kevlik, he first tried to sink my boilers. Failing in that, he ruined my iron chinks. Then he corked my fish trap, not because he needed more fish, but purely to spoil my catch. The day the run started, he bribed my fishermen to break their contracts, leaving me short-handed. He didn't need more men, but did that simply to cripple me. I got Indians to replace the white men, but he won them away by a miserable trick and by threats that I have no doubt he would make good if the poor devils dared to stand out. His men won't allow my fellows to work. We have had our nets cut and our fish thrown out. Last night we had a bad time on the banks, and a number of people were hurt. The situation is growing worse every hour, and there will be bloodshed unless this persecution stops. All I want is a fair chance. There are fish enough for us all in the Kevlik, but that man has used the power of your organization to ruin me, not for business reasons, but for personal spite. I have played the game squarely, Mr. Wayland, but unless this ceases, I'm through." You are through?" "Yes. The run is nearly a week old, and I haven't begun to pack my salmon. I have less than half a boat crew, and half of those are laid up." The president of the Trust stirred for the first time since Boyd had begun his recital. The grim lines about his mouth set themselves deeper, and staring with cold gray eyes at the speaker, he said, "Well, sir, what you have told me confirms my judgment that Willis Marsh is the right man in the right place." Completely taken back by this unexpected reply, Boyd exclaimed, "You don't mean to say that you approve of what he has done?" "Yes, of what I know he has done. Mr. Marsh is pursuing a definite policy laid down by his board of directors. You have shown me that he has done his work well. You knew before you left the East that we intended to crush all opposition." Emerson's voice was sharp as he cried, "I understand all that, but am I to understand also that the directors of the NAPA instructed him to kill me?" "Tut, tut, don't talk nonsense. You admit that you have no proof of Willis's connection with the attempt upon your life. You put yourself in the way of danger when you hired scab labor to break that strike. I think you got off very easily. If Marsh were instructed to crush the independents, why has he centered all his efforts on me alone? Why has he spent this summer in Kevlik and not among the other stations to the south? That is our business. Different methods are required in different localities." "Then you have no criticism to make? You uphold him?" Boyd's indignation was getting beyond control. "None whatever. I cannot agree that Marsh is even indirectly responsible for the collision of the scows, for the damage to your machinery, or for the fighting between the men. On the contrary, I know that he is doing his best to prevent violence, because it interferes with the catch. He hired your men because he needed them. Nobody knows who broke your machinery. As for your fish trap, you are privileged to build another or a dozen more wherever you please. Willis has already told me everything that you have said, and it strikes me that you have simply been out-generaled. Your complaints do not appeal to me. Even granting your absurd assumption that Marsh tried to put you out of the way, it seems to me that you have more than evened the score." "How?" "He is still wearing bandages over that knife thrust you gave him." Emerson leaped to his feet. "He knows I didn't do that. Everybody knows it," he cried. "He lied to you." "We won't discuss that," said Wayne Wayland curtly. "What do you want me to do?" "I want you to end this persecution. I want you to sail him off." "In other words, you want me to save you." Emerson swallowed. "I suppose it amounts to that. I want to be left alone. I want a square deal." "Well, I won't." Wayne Wayland's voice hardened suddenly. His sound white teeth snapped together. "You are getting exactly what you deserve. You betrayed me by spying upon me when you broke bread in my house. I see nothing reprehensible in Mr. Marsh's conduct, but even if I did, I would not censure him. Any measures are justifiable against a traitor." Boyd Emerson's face went gray beneath its coating of tan, and his voice threatened to break as he said, "I am no traitor, and you know it. I thought you a man of honor, and I came to you, not for help but for justice. But I see I was mistaken. I'm beginning to believe that Marsh acted under your instructions from the first." "Believe what you choose." "You think you've got me, but you haven't. I'll beat you yet." "You can't beat me at anything." Mr. Wayland's jaws were set like iron. "Not this year, perhaps, but next. You and Marsh have whipped me this time, but the salmon will come again, and I'll run my plant in spite of hell." Wayne Wayland made as if to speak, but Boyd went on unheeding. "You've taken a dislike to me, but your conduct shows that you fear me. You are afraid I'll succeed, and I will." "Brave talk," said the older man, "but you owe $100,000, and your stockholders will learn of your mismanagement." "Your persecution, you mean," cried the other. "I can explain. They will wait another year. I will raise more money, and they will stand by me." Perhaps I know more about that than you do. Emerson strode toward the desk menacingly, crying in a quivering voice, I want you to keep your hands off them. By God, don't try any of your financial trickery with me, or I'll... Wayne Wayland leaped from his chair, his face purple and his eyes flashing savagely. Leave this yacht, he thundered. I won't allow you to insult me. I won't stand your threats. I got you where I want you, and when the time comes you'll know it. Now get out. He stretched forth a great square hand and closed it so fiercely that the fingers cracked. I'll crush you like that. Boyd turned and strode from the cabin. Half blinded with anger, he stumbled down the ladder to his launch. Back to the plant, he ordered, then gazed with lowering brows and defiant eyes at the Grande Dame as she rested swan-like and serene at her moorings. His anger against Mildred's father destroyed for all time all thought of his disappointment at her own lack of understanding and her cool acceptance of his failure. He saw only that his affairs had reached the final climax where he must bow to the inevitable. Or, Big George's parting words came to him, strike one last blow in reprisal. A kind of sickening rage possessed him. He tried to fight fair against an enemy who knew no scruple, partly that he might win that enemy's respect. Now he was thoroughly beaten and humbled. After all, he was merely an adventurer without friends of resources. His long struggle had made him the type of man of whom desperate things might be expected. He might as well act the part. Why should he pretend to higher standards than Wayne Wayland or Marsh? George's way was best. By the time he reached the cannery, he had practically made up his mind. It was the hour of his darkest despair, the real crisis in his life. There are times when it rests with fate to make a strong man stronger or turn him altogether to evil. Such a man will not accept misfortune tamely. He is the reverse of those who are good through weakness. It is his nature to sin strongly. But the unexpected happened, and Boyd's black mood vanished in amazement at the sight which met his eyes. Moored to the fish dock was a lighter, awash with a cargo that made him stare and doubt his vision. He had seen his scanty crew of gill netters return empty-handed with the rising sun, exhausted, disheartened, depleted in numbers, yet there before him were thousands of salmon. They were strewn in a great mass upon the dock and inside the shed, while from the scow beneath they came in showers as the handlers tossed them upward from their pews. Through the wide doors he saw the backs of the butchers busily at work over their tables, and heard the uproar of his cannery running full for the first time. Before the launch had touched, he had leaped to the ladder and swung himself upon the dock. He stumbled into the arms of Big George. "Where did those fish come from?" he cried breathlessly. "From the trap." George smiled as he had not smiled in many weeks. "They've struck in like I knew they would, and they're running now by the thousands. I've fished these waters for years, but I never seen the likes of it. They'll tear that trap to pieces. They're smothering in the pot, tons and tons of 'em, with millions more milling below the leads, because they can't get in. It's a sight you'll not see once in a lifetime." "That means we can run the plant, that we can get all we can use?" "Hell, we've got enough fish to run 2 canneries. They've struck their gait, I tell you, and they'll never stop now, night or day, till they're through. We don't need no gill netters. What we need is butchers and slimers and handlers. There never was a trap site in the North till this one. I told Willis Marsh that years ago." He flung out a long, hairy arm, bared half to the shoulder, and waved it exultantly. "We built this plant to cook 40,000 salmon a day, but I'll bring you 3,000 every hour, and you've got to cook 'em, do you hear? And they couldn't cork us after all." Emerson leaned unsteadily against a pile, for his head was whirling. "No, we'll show that gang what a cannery can do. Marsh's traps will rot where they stand. Big George shook his tight clenched fist again. "We've won, my boy, we've won!" "Then don't let us stand here talking," cried Emerson, sharply. "Hurry! Hurry!" He turned and sped up the dock. He had come into his own at last, and he vowed with tight shut teeth that no wheel should stop, no belt should slacken, no man should leave his duty till the run had passed. At the entrance to the throbbing, clanging building, he paused an instant, and with a smile looked toward the yacht floating lazily in the distance. Then, with knees sagging beneath him from weariness, he entered. End of chapter 24. Recording by Richard Kilmer. Rio Medina, Texas.
Chapter 25 of the Silver Horde. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Phil Schempf. The Silver Horde by Rex Beach. Chapter 25. The Clash. "I've heard the news," cried Cherry, later that afternoon, shrieking to make herself heard above the rattle and jar of the machinery. "There seems to be a Providence that watches over fishermen," said Boyd. "I'm happy for your sake, and I want to apologize for my display of temper. Come away where I won't have to scream so. I want to talk to you." "It's music to my ears," he answered, as he led her past the rows of Chinamen bowed before their soldering torches as if busied with some heathen rites. "But I am glad to sit down just the same. I've been on my feet for 36 hours." "You poor boy. Why don't you take some sleep?" "I can't. George is coming with another load of fish, and the plant is so new I'm afraid to leave it even for an hour." "It's too much for one man," she declared. "Oh, I'll sleep tomorrow." "Did you see her?" questioned Cherry. "Yes." "She must be very proud of you," she said, wistfully. I don't think she understands what I'm trying to do, or what it means. Our talk was not very satisfactory." "She surely must have understood what Marsh is doing." "I didn't tell her that." "Why not?" "What good would it have done?" "Why?" Cherry seemed bewildered. "She could put a stop to it. She could use her influence with her father against Marsh. I expected to see your old crew back at work again. Oh, I wish I had her power." "She wouldn't take a hand under any circumstances. It wouldn't occur to her, and naturally I wouldn't ask her." Boyd flushed uncomfortably. "Thanks to George's trap, there's no need." He went on to tell Cherry of the scene with Mr. Wayland and its stormy ending. "They must have used all their resources to down you," she said, "but luck is with you. You mustn't let them succeed. Now is the time to show them what is in you. Go in and win her now, against all of them." He was grateful for her sympathy, yet somehow it made him uncomfortable. "What was it you wished to see me about?" he asked. "Oh, have you seen Chakawana?" "No." "She disappeared early this morning, soon after the yacht came in. I can't find her anywhere. She took the baby with her, and I'm worried." "Doesn't Constantine know where she is?" "Why, Constantine is down here, isn't he?" "He hasn't been here since yesterday." Cherry rose nervously. "There is something wrong, Boyd. They have been acting queerly for a long time." "Then you're alone at your place," he said, thoughtfully. "I think you had better come down here." "Oh, no." "I shall send some one up to spend the night at your house. You shouldn't be left unprotected." But just then Constantine came sauntering around the corner of the building. "Thank Heaven!" cried Cherry. "He will know where the others are." But when his mistress questioned him, Constantine merely replied, "I don't know. I no see Chakawana. They have been gone since morning, and I can't find them anywhere." "Huh! I guess they're all right." "There is something queer about this," said Emerson. "Where have you been all day?" "I go sleep. I tired from fighting last night. I come back now and go work. Bime Chakawana come back too, I guess." "Well, I don't need you tonight, so you better go back to Cherry's house and stay there till I send for you." Constantine acquiesced calmly, and a few minutes later accompanied his mistress up the beach. As she passed Marsh's cannery, Cherry saw a tender moored to the dock, and noticed strangers among the buildings. They stared at her curiously, as if the sight of a white girl attended by a copper-hued giant were part of the picturesqueness they expected. As she drew near her own house, she saw a woman approaching, and while yet a stone's throw distant, she recognized her. A jealous tightening of her throat and a flutter at her breast told her that this was Mildred Wayland. Cherry would have passed on silently, but Miss Wayland checked her. "Pardon me," she said. "Will you tell me what that odd-looking building is used for?" She pointed to the village above. "That is the Greek church." "How interesting. Are there many Greeks here?" "No. It's a relic of the Russian days. The natives worship there." "I intended to go closer, but the walking is not very good, is it?" She glanced down at her dainty French shoes, then at Cherry's hunting boots. "Do you live here?" "Yes, in the log house yonder." "Indeed. I tried to find someone there, but—" "You were out, of course." "You have it arranged very cosily, I see." Mildred's manner was faintly patronizing. She was vexed at the beauty and evident refinement of this woman whom she had thought to find so different. "If you will go back, I will show you from the inside, Miss Wayland." Cherry enjoyed her start at the name and the look of cold hostility that followed. "You had the advantage of me," said Mildred. "I do not think we had met. You are—" She raised her brows inquiringly. "Cherry Malotte, of course." "I remember. Mr. Marsh spoke of you." "I am sorry." "I beg your pardon?" "I say I am sorry Mr. Marsh ever spoke of me." Mildred smiled frigidly. "Evidently you do not like him." "Nobody in Alaska likes him. Do you?" "You see, I'm not an Alaskan." It occurred to Cherry that this girl was ignorant of the unexpected change in Boyd's affairs. She decided to sound her, to find out for herself the answer to those questions which Boyd had evaded. He had not spoken to Mildred of Marsh. Perhaps, if she knew the truth, she would love him better, and even now her assistance would not be valueless. "Do you know that Mr. Marsh is to blame for all of Boyd's misfortune?" she said. "Boyd's?" "Yes, Boyd's, of course. Oh, let's not pretend. I call him by his first name. I think you ought to know the truth about this business, even if Boyd is too chivalrous to tell you." "What do you think he has not told me?" "I have just come from him. If Mr. Emerson blames anyone but himself for his failure, I am sure he would have told me." "Then you don't know him." "I never knew him to ask another to defend him." "He never asked me to defend him. I merely thought if you knew the truth you might help him." "I? How?" "It is for you to find a way. He has met with opposition and treachery at every step. I think it is time someone came to his aid." "He has had your assistance at all times, has he not?" "I have tried to help whenever I could, but I haven't your power." Mildred shrugged her shoulders. "You even went to Seattle to help him, did you not?" "I went there on my own business." "Why do you take such an interest in Mr. Emerson's affairs, may I ask?" "It was I who induced him to take up this venture," said Cherry, proudly. "I found him discouraged, ready to give up. I helped to put new heart into him. I have something at stake in the enterprise, too, but that's nothing. I hate to see a good man driven to the wall by a scoundrel like Marsh." "Wait. There is something to be said on both sides. Mr. Marsh was magnanimous enough to overlook that attempt upon his life." "What attempt?" "You must have heard. He was wounded in the shoulder. Didn't Boyd tell you the truth about that?" "He told me everything," said Mildred coldly. This woman's attitude was unbearable. It would seem that she even dared to criticize her, Mildred Wayland, for her treatment of Boyd. She pretended to a truer friendship, a more intimate knowledge of him. But no, it wasn't pretense. It was too natural, too unconscious for that, and therein lay the sting. "I shall ask him about it again this evening," she continued. "If there has really been persecution, as you suggest, I shall tell my father." "You won't see Boyd this evening," said Cherry. "Oh, yes, I shall." "He is very busy, and—" "I don't think he can see you." "You don't understand. I told him to come out to the yacht." Mildred's temper rose at the light she saw in the other woman's face. "But if he should disappoint you," Cherry insisted, "remember that the fish are running, and you have no time to lose if you are going to help." Mildred tossed her head. "To be frank with you, I never liked this enterprise of Boyd's. Now that I have seen the place and the people, well, I can't say I like it any better." "The country is a bit different, but the people are much the same in Kalvik and in Chicago. You will find unscrupulous men and unselfish women everywhere." Mildred gave her a cool glance that took her in from head to foot. "And vice versa, I dare say. You speak from a wider experience than I." With a careless nod, she picked her way toward the launch, where her friends were already assembling. She was angry and suspicious. Her pride was hurt because she had not been able to feel superior to the other woman. Instead, she had descended to the weak resource of innuendo, while Cherry had been simple and direct. She had expected to recognize instantly the type of person with whom she had to deal, but she found herself baffled. Who was this woman? What was she doing here? Why had Boyd never told her of this extraordinary intimacy? She remembered more than one occasion when he had defended the woman. She resolved to put an end to the affair at once. Boyd must either give up Cherry or... During the talk between the two young women, Constantine had kept a respectful distance, but when Mildred had gone he came up to Cherry with the question: "Who is that?" "That is Miss Wayland. That is the richest girl in the world, Constantine." "What?" "And the pity of it is she doesn't understand how very rich she is. Her father owns all these canneries and many more besides, and lots of railroads. But you don't know what a railroad is, do you?" "Maybe him rich as Mr. Marsh, eh?" "1,000 times richer. Mr. Marsh works for him the way you work for me." Being too much a gentleman to dispute his mistress's word, Constantine merely shook his head and smiled broadly. "She fine lady," he acknowledged. "She got plenty nice dress." "Silk." "Yes, silk." "She more handsomer than you be," he added with reluctant candor. "Maybe that's lie 'bout Mr. Marsh, eh? White men all work for Mr. Marsh. He no work for nobody." "No, it's true. Mr. Marsh knows how rich she is, and that's why he wants to marry her." The breed wheeled swiftly. His soft soles crunched in the gravel. "Mr. Marsh would marry her?" he repeated, as if doubting his ears. "Yes, that is why he fought Mr. Emerson. They both want to marry her. That is why Marsh broke Mr. Emerson's machinery and hired his men away from him and cut his nets. They hate each other. Do you understand?" "Me savvy," said Constantine shortly, then strode on beside the girl. "Me think all the time Mr. Emerson goin' marry you." Cherry gasped. "Oh, no. Why, he's in love with Miss Wayland." "S'pose he don't marry her?" "Then Mr. Marsh will get her, I dare say." After a moment Constantine announced with conviction: "I guess Mr. Marsh is damn bad man." "I'm glad you have discovered that. He has even tried to kill Mr. Emerson. That shows the sort of man he is." "It's good thing get married," said Constantine vaguely. "The father say, if woman don't marry, she go to hell." "I hate to think that," laughed the girl. "That's true," the other affirmed stoutly. "The priest, he say so, and priest don't lie. He say man takes a woman and don't get married, they both go to hell and burn forever. By little baby come, and he go to hell too." "Oh, I understand. The father wants to make sure of his people, and he's quite right. You natives haven't observed the law very carefully." "He say Indian woman stop with white man. She never see Jesus house no more. She go to hell sure, and baby go too. You s'pose that's true?" "I dare say it is in a way." "By God, that's tough on little baby!" exclaimed Constantine fervently. All that night Boyd stayed at his post, while the cavernous building shuddered and hissed to the straining toil of the machines and the gasping breath of the furnaces. As the darkness gathered, he had gone out upon the dock to look regretfully toward the twinkling lights on the Grande, then turned doggedly back to his labors. Another load had just arrived from the trap. Already the plant, untried by the stress of a steady run, was clogged and working far below capacity. He would have sent Mildred word, but he had not a single man to spare. At 10 o'clock the next morning he staggered into his quarters, more dead than alive. In his heart was a great thankfulness that Big George had not found him wanting. The last defective machine was mended, the last weakness strengthened, and the plant had reached its fullest stride. The fish might come now in any quantity. The rest was but a matter of coal and iron and human endurance. Meanwhile he would sleep. He met Fingerless Fraser emerging, decked royally in all the splendor of new clothes and spotless linen. "Where are you going?" Boyd asked him. "I'm going out into society." "Clyde is taking you to the yacht, eh?" "No, he's afraid of my work, so I'm going out on my own. He told me all about the swell quilts at the Marsh's place, so I thought I'd lam up there and look them over. I may cop an heiress," he winked wisely. "If I see one that looks gentle, I'm liable to grab me some bride. He says there ain't one that's got less than a couple of millions in her kick." Boyd was too weary to do more than wish him success, but it seemed that fortune favored Fraser, for before he had gone far he saw a young woman seated in a patch of wildflowers, plucking the blossoms with careless hand, while she drank in the beauty of the bright Arctic morning. She was simply dressed, yet looked so prosperous that Fraser instantly decided, "That's her. I'll spread my cheeks with this one." "Good morning," he began. The girl gave him an indifferent glance from two fearless eyes, and nodded slightly, but Fingerless Fraser, upon occasion, could summon a smile that was peculiarly engaging. He did so now, seating himself, hat in hand, with the words, "If you don't mind, I'll rest a minute. I'm out on my morning walk. It's a nice day, isn't it?" As she did not answer, he ran on glibly, "My name is de Benville. I'm one of the New Orleans branch. That's my cannery down yonder." He pointed in the direction from which he had come. "Indeed," said the young lady. "Yes, it's mine." A wrinkle gathered at the corner of the stranger's eyes. Her face showed a flicker of amusement. "I thought that was Mr. Emerson's cannery," she said. "Oh, the idea! He only runs it for me. I put up the money. You know him, eh?" The girl nodded. "Yes, I know Mr. Clyde also." "Who? Alton?" he queried with reassuring warmth. "Why, you and I have got mutual friends. Alton and me is pals." He shook his head solemnly. "Ain't he a scourge?" "I beg your pardon?" "I say, ain't he an awful thing? He ain't anything like Emerson. There's a ring-tailed swallow, all right, all right. I like him." "Are you very intimate with him?" "Am I? I'm closer to him than porous plaster. When Boyd ain't around, I'm him, that's all." From her look, Fraser judged that he was progressing finely. He hastened to add, "I always like to help out young fellows like him. I like to give 'em a chance. That's my name, you know, Chancy de Benville. Always game to take a chance. Is that your yacht?" "No, my father and I are merely passengers." "So you trailed the old skeezicks along with you. Well, that's right. Make the most of your father while you got him. If I'd paid more attention to mine, I'd have been better off now, but I was wild." Fraser winked in a manner to inform his listener that all worldly wisdom was his. "I wanted to be a jockey, and the old party cut me off. What I've got now, I made all by myself, but if I stayed in Bloomington, I might have been president of the bank by this time." "Bloomington? I understood you to say New Orleans." "My old man had a whole string of banks," Fraser averred hastily. "Tell me, is Mr. Emerson ill?" asked the girl. "Ill enough to lick a den of wildcats." "He intended to come out to the yacht last night, but he disappointed us." "He's busy as an anthill. I met him turning in just as I came out for my constitutional." "Where had he been all night?" Her voice betrayed an interest that Fraser was quick to detect. He answered cannily, "You can search me. I don't keep cases on him. As long as he does his work, I don't care where he goes at quitting time." He resolved that this girl should learn nothing from him. "There seems to be very few white women in this place," she said after a pause. "Only one till you people came. Maybe you've crossed her trail." "Hardly." "Oh, she's all right. Take it on the word of a fireman. She's an ace." "Mr. Emerson told me about her. He seems quite fond of her." "I've always said they make a swell-looking pair." "One can hardly blame her for trying to catch him." "Oh, you can make book that she didn't start no love-making. She ain't the kind to curl up in a man's ear and whisper. She don't have to. All she needs to do is look natural, and men will fall like ripe persimmons." "They have been together a great deal, I suppose." "Every hour of the day, and the days are long," said Fraser cheerfully. "But he ain't crippled. He could have walked away if he wanted to. It's a good thing he didn't, though, because she's done more to win this bet for us than we've done ourselves." "She's unusually pretty," the girl remarked coldly. "Yes, and she's just as bright as she is good-looking. But I don't care for blondes." Fraser gazed admiringly at the brown hair before him, and rolled his eyes eloquently. I'm strong for brunettes, I am. It's the Creole blood in me." She gathered up her wildflowers and rose, saying, "I must be going." "I'll go with you." He jumped to his feet with alacrity. "Thank you. I prefer to walk alone." "Couldn't think of it. I'll—" He paused at the lift of her brows and the extraordinary frigid look she gave him. He stood in his tracks and watched her descend the river trail. "Declined with thanks," he murmured. "I'd need ear muffs and mittens to handle her. I think I'll build me some bonfire and thaw out. She must own the mint." At the upper cannery Mildred found Alton Clyde with the younger Berry girl. She called him aside and talked earnestly with him for several minutes. "All right," he said at length. "I'm glad to get out, of course. The rest is up to you." Mildred's lips were white and her voice was hard as she cried, "I'm thoroughly sick of it all. I have played the fool long enough." "Now look here," Clyde objected weakly. "You may be mistaken, and it doesn't look like quite the square thing to do." But she silenced him with an angry gesture. "Leave that to me. I'm through with him." "All right. Let's hunt up the governor." Together they went to the office in search of Wayne Wayland. Half an hour later, when Clyde rejoined Miss Berry, she noticed he seemed ill at ease, gazing down the bay with a worried, speculative look in his colorless eyes. Boyd Emerson roused from his death-like slumber late in the afternoon, still worn from his long strain and aching in every muscle. He was in wretched plight physically, but his heart was aglow with gladness. Big George was still at the trap, and the unceasing rumble from across the way told him that the fish were still coming in. As he was finishing his breakfast, a watchman appeared in the doorway. "There's a launch at the dock with some people from above," he announced. "I stopped them according to orders, but they want to see you." "Show them to my office." Boyd rose and went into the other building, where a moment later he was confronted by Wayne Wayland and Willis Marsh. The old man nodded to him shortly. Marsh began, "We heard about your good fortune. Mr. Wayland has come to look over your plant." "It's not for sale." "How many fish are you getting?" "That's my business." He turned to Mr. Wayland. "I hardly expected to see you here. Haven't you insulted me enough?" "Just a moment before you order me out. I'm a stockholder in this company, and I'm within my rights." "You a stockholder? How much stock do you own? Where'd you get it?" "I own 35,000 shares outright." Mr. Wayland tossed a packet of certificates upon the table. "And I have options on all the stock you placed in Chicago. I said you would hear from me when the time came." "So you think the time has come to crush me, eh?" said Emerson. "Well, you've been swindled. Only 1/3 of the capital stock has been sold, and Alton Clyde holds 35,000 shares of that." The old man smiled grimly. "I have not been swindled." "Then Clyde sold out!" exploded Boyd. "Yes. I paid him back the $10,000 he put in, and took over the 25,000 shares you got Mildred to take." "Mildred?" Emerson started as if he'd been struck. "Are you insane? Mildred doesn't own—" "Why, Alton never told me who put up that money." "Don't tell me you didn't know!" cried Wayne Wayland. "You knew all the time. You worked your friends out, and then sent that whippersnapper to my daughter when you saw you were about to fail. You managed well. You knew she couldn't refuse." "How did you find out that she held the stock?" "She told me, of course." "Don't ask me to believe that. If she hadn't told you before, she wouldn't tell you now. All I can say is that she acted of her own free will. I never dreamed that she put up that $25,000. What do you intend to do, now that you have taken over these holdings?" "What do you think? I would spend 10 times the money to save my daughter." The old man was quivering. "You are only a minority shareholder. The control of this enterprise still rests with me and my friends." "Your friends!" cried Mr. Wayland. "That's what brings me here. You and your friends! I'll break you and your friends if it takes my fortune." "I can understand your dislike of me, but my associates have never harmed you." "Your associates! And who are they? A lawless ruffian who openly threatened Willis Marsh's murder, and a loose woman from the dance halls." "Take care!" cried Emerson in a sharp voice. The old man waved his hands as if at a loss for words. "Look here! You can't be an utter idiot. You must know who she is." "Do you? Then tell me." Wayne Wayland turned his back in disgust. "Do you really wish to know?" Marsh's smooth voice questioned. "I do." "She is a very common sort," said Willis Marsh. "I'm surprised that you never heard of her while you were in the upper country. She followed the mining camps and lived as such women do. She's an expert with cards, even dealt faro in some of the camps." "How do you know?" "I looked up her history in Seattle. She's very notorious." "People talk like that about every woman in Alaska." "I didn't come here to argue about that woman's character," broke in Mr. Wayland. "You have said enough now so that you will either prove your words or apologize. If you want proof, take your own relation with her. It's notorious. Even Mildred has heard of it. I can explain to her in a word. Perhaps you can also explain the affair with Hilliard. If so, you had better do it. I suppose you didn't know anything about that, either. I suppose you don't know why he advanced the loan after once refusing it. They have a name for men like you who take money from women of her sort." Emerson uttered a terrible cry, and his face blanched to a gray pallor. "Do you mean to say I sent her to Hilliard?" "Hilliard's as good as told me so himself. Do you wonder that I am willing to spend a fortune to protect my girl from a man like you? I'm going to break you. I've got a foothold in this enterprise of yours, and I'll root you out if it takes $1,000,000. I'll kick you back into the gutter where you belong." Boyd stood appalled at the violence of this outburst. The man seemed insane. He could not find words to answer him. "You did not come down here to tell me that," he said at last. "No. I came here with a message for Mildred. She has told me to dismiss you once and for all." "I shall take my dismissal from no one but her. I can explain everything." "I expected you to say that. If you want her own words, read this." With shaking fingers he thrust a letter before Emerson's eyes. "Read it." The young man opened the envelope and read, in a handwriting he knew only too well: "Dear Boyd, this conviction has been growing on me for some time that you and I have made a serious mistake. It's not necessary to go into details. Let us spare each other that unpleasantness. I am familiar with all that father will say to you, and his feelings are mine. Hence there is no necessity for further explanations. Believe me, this is much the simplest way. Mildred." Boyd crushed the note in his palm and tossed it away carelessly. "You dictate well," he said quietly, "but I shall tell her the truth, and she will—" "Oh, no, you won't. You won't see her again. I've seen to that. Mildred is engaged to Willis Marsh. It's all settled. I warn you to keep away. Her engagement has been announced to all our friends on the yacht. I tell you I won't take my dismissal from anyone but her. I shall come aboard the Grande tonight. Mr. Marsh and I may have something to say to that." Boyd wheeled upon Marsh with a look that made him recoil. "If you try to cross me, I'll strip your back and lash you till you howl like a dog." Marsh's florid face went pale. His tongue suddenly became too dry for speech. But Wayne Wayland was not to be cowed. "I warn you again to keep away from my daughter," he cried furiously. "And I warn you that I shall come aboard the yacht tonight alone." The president of the trust turned, and, followed by his lieutenant, left the room without another word. End of chapter 25. Chapter 26 of the Silver Horde. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Phil Schempf. The Silver Horde, by Rex Beach, Chapter 26, in which a score is settled. Cherry Malotte, coming down to the cannery on her daily visit, saw Willis Marsh and Mr. Wayland leaving it. Wondering, she hurried into the main building in search of Boyd. The place was as busy as when she had left it on the afternoon before, and she saw that the men had been at work all night. Many of them were sprawled in corners where they had sunk from weariness, snatching a moment's rest before the boss kicked them back to their posts. The Chinese hands were stoically performing their tasks, their yellow faces haggard with the strain. At the butchering tables, yesterday's crew was still slitting, slashing, hacking at the pile of fish that never seemed to grow less. Some of them were giving up, staggering away to their bunks, while others with more vitality had stood so long in the slime and salt drip that their feet had swelled, and it had become necessary to cut off their shoes. Boyd was standing in the door of the office. In a few words he told her of Mr. Wayland's threat. "Do you think he can injure the company?" she inquired anxiously. "I haven't a doubt of it. He can work very serious harm at least." "Tell me, why did he turn against you so suddenly? What made Miss Wayland angry with you?" I would rather not." "Why, I'm your partner, and I ought to be told. You and George and I will have to work together closer than ever now. Don't let's begin by concealing anything." "Well, perhaps you'd better know the whole thing," said Boyd slowly. "Mildred does not like you. Her father's mind has been poisoned by Marsh. It seems they resent our friendship. They believe all sorts of things. So I am the cause of your trouble, after all. They blame me equally, more than you. It seems that Marsh made an inquiry into your life history, and he babbled all the gossip he heard to them. Of course they believe it, not knowing you as I do, and they misunderstood our friendship. But I can explain, and I shall, to Mildred. Then I shall prove Marsh a liar. Perhaps I can show Mr. Wayland that he is in the wrong. It's our only hope." "What did Marsh say about me?" asked the girl. She was pale to the lips. "He said a lot of things that at any other time I would have made him swallow on the spot. But it's only a pleasure deferred. With your help, I'll do it in their presence. I don't like to tell you this, but the truth is vital to us all, and I want to arm myself." Cherry was silent. "You may leave it to me," he said gently. "I will see that Marsh sets you right." "There is nothing to set right," the girl said wearily. "Marsh told the truth, I dare say." "The truth? My God, you don't know what you're saying." "Yes, I do." She returned his look of shocked horror with half-hearted defiance. "You must have known who I am. Fraser knew, and he must have told you. You knew I had followed the mining camps. You knew I had lived by my wits. You must have known what people thought of me. I cast my lot in with the people of this country, and I had to match my wits with those of every man I met. Sometimes I won, sometimes I did not. You know the North." "I didn't know," he said slowly. "I never thought I wouldn't allow myself to think." "Why not? It's nothing to you. You have lived, and so have I. I made mistakes. What girl doesn't who has to fight her way alone? But my past is my own. It concerns nobody but me." She saw the change in his face, and a reckless spirit rose. "Oh, I've shocked you. You think all women should be like Miss Wayland. Have you ever stopped to think that even you are not the same man you were when you came fresh from college? You know the world now. You have tasted its wickedness. Would you change your knowledge for your earlier innocence? You know you would not, and you have no right to judge me by a separate code. What difference does it make who I am or what I have done? I didn't ask your record when I gave you the chance to win Miss Wayland, and neither you nor she have any right to challenge mine." "I agree with you in that." "I came away from the mining camps because of wagging tongues, because I was forever misjudged. Whatever I may have been, I have at least played fair with that girl. It hurts me now to be accused by her. I saw your love for her, and I never tried to rob her. Oh, don't look as if I couldn't have done differently if I had tried. I could have injured her very easily if I had been the sort she thinks me. But I helped you in every way I could. I made sacrifices. I did things she would never have done." She stopped on the verge of tears. Boyd felt the justice of her words. He could not forget the unselfish devotion and loyalty she had shown throughout his long struggle. For the 100th time there came to him the memory of her services in the matter of Hilliard's loan, and the thought caused him unspeakable distress. "Why did you do all this?" he asked. "Don't you know?" Cherry gazed at him with a faint smile. Then, for the first time, the whole truth burst upon him. The surprise of it almost deprived him of speech, and he stammered, "No, I " Then he fell silent. "What little I did because I love you," said the girl, in a tired voice. "You may as well know, for it makes no difference now." "I'm sorry," he said, gripped by a strong emotion that made him go hot and cold. "I have been a fool." "No, you were merely wrapped up in your own affairs. You see, I have been living my own life, and was fairly contented till you came. Then everything changed. For a long time I hoped you might grow to love me as I loved you, but I found it was no use. When I saw you so honest and unselfish in your devotion to that other girl, I thought it was my chance to do something unselfish in my turn. It was hard, but I did my best. I think I must love you in the same way you love her, Boyd, for there's nothing in all the world I would not do to make you happy. That's all there is to the poor little story, and won't make any difference now except that you and I can't go on as we have done. I shall never have the courage to come back after this. You will win, Miss Wayland, yet, and attain your heart's desire. I am only sorry that I have made it harder for you, that I cannot help you any further, but I cannot. There is but one thing more I can do." "I want no more sacrifice," he cried roughly. "I've been blind. I've taken too much from you already." The girl stood for a moment with her eyes turned toward the river. Then she said, "I must think. I want to go away. Goodbye." "Goodbye," he returned, and stood watching her as she hurried away, half suspecting the tears that were trembling amid her lashes. It was not until supper time that Boyd saw Fingerless Fraser and questioned him about his quest for an heiress. "Nothing doing in the heiress business," replied the adventurer. "I couldn't stand the exposure." "They were cold, eh?" "Yep, they weathered me out." "Did you really meet any of those people?" "Sure, I met 'em all, but I didn't catch their names. I made one before I'd gone a mile. Tall, slim party, with cracked ice in her voice." Boyd looked up quickly. "Did you introduce yourself?" "As Chancy de Benville, that's all." "How is that for a drawing-room moniker?" "She fell for the name all right, but there must have been something phony about the clothes. That's the trouble with this park harness. If I'd worn my soup and fish and my 2-gallon hat, I'd have passed for a gentleman sure. I'm strong for those evening togs. I see another one later, a little Maduro-colored skirt with a fat nose." "Miss Barry." "I'm glad to meet her. I officed her out of a rowboat and told her I was Mr. Yonkers of New York. We was breezing along on the bit till Clyde broke it up. He called me Fraser, and it was cold in a minute. Fraser's a cheap name, anyhow. I'm sorry I took it." "Do you mean to say it isn't your real name?" asked his companion in genuine bewilderment. "Nah. Switzer is what I was born with. Say it slow and it sounds like an air brake, don't it? I never won a bet as long as I packed it around, and Fraser hasn't got it beat by more than a lip." "Well," Boyd breathed deeply, "you are the limit." "Speaking of clothes, I noticed you're dressed up like a fruit salad. What is it, the yacht?" "Yes." "You'd better hurry. She sails at high tide." "Sails?" "Alton told me so, and said that he was going along." "Thank heaven for that, anyhow. But I don't understand about the other." Boyd voiced the question that was foremost in his mind. "Did you know Cherry in the upper country?" "Nope." "She said you did." "She said that?" "Yes. She thought you'd told me who she was." "Hell! She might have known I'd never crack. It's her own business, and I've got troubles enough with this cannery on my hands." "I wish you'd told me," said Emerson. "Why, there's no use rehearsing the dog-eared dope. Nobody can live the past over again, and who wants to repeat the present? It's only the future that's worth while. I guess her future is just as good as anybody's." "What she told me came as a shock." Fingerless Fraser grunted. "I don't know why. For my part, I can't stand for an ingenue. If I ever get married, Cherry's the sort for me. I'm out of the kindergarten myself, and I hate to spend my life cutting paper figures for my wife. No, sir. If I ever sees a frill, I want her to know as much as me. Then she won't tear away with the first dark-eyed diamond broker that stops in front of my place to crank up his whiz-buggy. You never heard of a wise woman breaking up her own home, did you? It's the pink-faced dolls from the seminary that fall for Bertie, the beautiful cloak model." Fraser whittled himself a toothpick as he went on. "A feller in my line of business don't gather much useful information, but he certainly gets Jerry to the female question in all its dips, angles, and spurs. Cherry Malotte is the squarest girl I ever saw, and while she may have been crowded at the turn, she'll finish true. It takes a thoroughbred to do that, and the guy that gets her will win his derby. Now, those fillies on the yacht, for instance, warm up fine, but you can't tell how they'll run." "We're not talking of marriage," said Boyd as he rose. When he had gone out, Fraser ruminated aloud. "Maybe not. I ain't very bright, and we may have been talking about the weather. However, if you're after that wildflower dame with the cold storage talk instead of Cherry Malotte, Why, I hope you get her. There's no accounting for tastes. I certainly did my best to send you along this morning." Turning to the Jap steward, he remarked sagely, "My boy, always remember one thing. If you can't boost, don't knock." Wayne Wayland was by no means sure that Boyd would not make good his threat to visit the yacht that evening, and in any case he wished to be prepared. A scene before the other passengers of the Grande was not to be thought of. Besides, if the young man were roughly handled, it would make him a martyr in Mildred's eyes. He talked over the matter with Marsh, who suggested that the sightseers should dine ashore and spend the evening with him at the plant. With only Mildred and her father left on the yacht, there would be no possibility of scandal, even if Emerson were mad enough to force an interview. "And what's more," declared Mr. Wayland, "I shall give orders to clear on the high tide. That fellow is a menace, and the sooner Mildred is away from him the better. You shall go with us, my boy." But when he went to Mildred to explain the nature of his arrangements, he found her in a furious temper. "Why did you announce my engagement to Mr. Marsh?" she demanded angrily. "The whole ship is talking about it. By what right did you do that?" "I did it for your own sake," said the old man. "This whelp, Emerson, has made a fool of you and of me long enough. There must be an end to it." "But I don't love Willis Marsh," she cried. "You forget I'm of age." "Nonsense! Willis is a fine fellow. He loves you, and he is the best business man for his years I have ever known. If it were not for this foolish boy and girl affair, you would return his love. He suits me, and, well, I've put my foot down, so there's an end of it." "Do you intend to force me to marry him?" Mr. Wayland recognized the danger signal. "Absurd! Take all the time you wish. You'll come around all right. That reprobate you were engaged to defied me and defended that woman." He told of his stormy interview with Boyd, concluding, "It is fortunate we found him out, Mildred. I have guarded you all my life. I have lavished everything money could buy upon you. I have built up the greatest fortune in all the West for you. I have kept you pure and sweet and good. And to think that such a fellow should dare—" Mr. Wayland choked with anger. "The one thing I cannot stand in a man or a woman is immorality. I have lived clean myself, and my son shall be as clean as I." "Did you say that Boyd threatened to come aboard this evening?" questioned the girl. "Yes, but I swore he should not." "And still he repeated his threat?" Mildred's eyes were strangely bright. She was smiling as if to herself. "He did, the braggart. He better not try it." "Then he'll come," said Mildred. It was twilight when Willis Marsh was rowed out to the yacht. He found Mr. Wayland and Mildred seated in deck chairs enjoying the golden sunset while the old man smoked. Marsh explained that he had excused himself from his guests to go whither his inclination led him, and drew his seat close to Mildred, rejoicing in the fact that no one could gainsay him this privilege. In reality, he had been drawn to the Grande largely by a lurking fear of Emerson. He was not entirely sure of the girl, and would not feel secure until the shores of Kalvik had sunk from sight and his rival had been left behind. But in spite of his uneasiness, it was the happiest moment of his life. If he had failed to ruin his enemy in the precise way he had planned, he was fairly satisfied with what he had accomplished. He had shifted the battle to stronger shoulders, and he had gained the woman he wanted. Moreover, he had won the unfaltering loyalty of Wayne Wayland, the dominant figure of the West. Nothing could keep him now from the success his ambition demanded. It added to his satisfaction to note the group of lusty sailors at the rail. He almost wished that Emerson would try to come aboard, that he might witness his discomfiture. Meanwhile, he did his best to be pleasant. His complacent enjoyment was interrupted at last by the approach of the second officer, who announced that a lady wished to see Mr. Wayland. "A lady?" asked the old man in surprise. "Yes, sir. She came alongside in a small boat just now, with some natives. I stopped her at the landing, but she says she must see you at once." "Ah, that woman again!" Mr. Wayland's jaws snapped. "Tell her to be gone. I refuse to see her." "Very well, sir." The mate turned, but Mildred said suddenly, "Wait. Why don't you talk to her, father?" "That creature? I have nothing to say to her." "Quite right," agreed Marsh, with a cautionary glance at the speaker. "She's up to some trick." "She may have something really important to say to you," urged the girl. "No." Mildred leaned forward and called to the ship's officer. "Show her up. I will see her." "Mildred, you mustn't talk to that woman," her father cried. "It's very unwise," Marsh chimed in, apprehensively. "She isn't the sort of person—" Miss Wayland chilled him with a look and waved the maid away, then sank back into her chair. "I have talked with her already. I assure you she is not dangerous." "Have your own way," Mr. Wayland grunted. "But it is bound to lead to something unpleasant. She has probably come with a message from that fellow." Willis Marsh squirmed uncomfortably in his seat. He fixed his eyes upon the knot of men at the starboard rail. An expression of extreme alertness came over his bland features. His feet were drawn under him, and his fingers were clenched upon the arms of his chair. Then, with a sharp indrawing of his breath, he leaped up and darted down the deck. Over the side had come Cherry Malotte, accompanied by an Indian girl in shawl and moccasins, a slim, shrinking creature who stood as if bewildered, twisting her hands and staring about with frightened eyes. Behind them, head and shoulders above the sailors, towered a giant, copper-hued breed with a child in his arms. They saw that Marsh was speaking to the newcomers, but could not distinguish his words. The Indian girl fell back as if terrified. She cried out something in her own tongue, shook her head violently, and pointed to her white companion. Marsh's face was livid. He shook a quivering hand in Cherry Malotte's face. It seemed as if he would strike her, but Constantine strode between them, scowling silently down into the smaller man's face, his own visage saturnine and menacing. Marsh retreated a step, chattering excitedly. Then Cherry's voice came clearly to the listeners. "It's too late now, Mr. Marsh. You may as well face the music." Followed by the stares of the sailors, she came up the deck towards the old man and his daughter, who had arisen, the Indian girl clinging to her sleeve, the tall breed striding noiselessly behind. Willis Marsh came with them, his white lips writhing, his face like putty. He made futile, detaining grasps at Constantine, and in the silence that suddenly descended upon the ship they heard him whispering. "What is the meaning of this?" demanded Mr. Wayland. "I heard you were about to sail, so I came out to see you before—" Marsh broke in hoarsely. "She's a bad woman. She has come here for blackmail." "Blackmail?" cried Wayne Wayland. "I thought as much. That's her game. She wants money." Cherry shrugged her shoulders and showed her white teeth in a smile. "Mr. Marsh anticipates slightly. You may judge if he is right." Marsh started to speak, but Mildred Wayland, who had been watching him intently, was before him. "Who sent you here, miss?" "No one sent me. If Mr. Marsh will stop his chatter, I can make myself understood." "Don't listen to her." Cherry turned upon him swiftly. "You've got to face it, so you may as well keep still." He fell silent. "We heard Mr. Marsh was going away with you, and I came out to ask him for enough money to support his child while he's gone." "His child?" Wayne Wayland turned upon his daughter's fiancé with a face of stern surprise. "Willis, tell her she is lying." "She's lying," repeated Marsh obediently, but they saw the truth in his face. Cherry spoke directly to Miss Wayland now. "I have supported this little fellow and his mother for a year." She indicated the red-haired youngster in Constantine's arms. "This is all I care to do. When you people arrived, Mr. Marsh induced Chakawana to take the baby up river to a fishing camp and stay there until you had gone. But Constantine heard that he intended to marry you, and hearing also that he intended leaving tonight, Constantine brought his sister back in the hope that Mr. Marsh would do what is right. You see, he promised to marry Chakawana long before he met you." Mildred could have done murder at the expression she saw in Cherry's face. This woman she had scorned had humbled her in earnest. With flashing eyes she turned upon her father. "Since you were so prompt in announcing my engagement, perhaps you can deny it with equal promptness." "Good God, what a scandal, if this is true!" Wayne Wayland wiped his forehead. "Oh, it's true," said Cherry. In the silence that followed, the child struggled out of Constantine's arms and stood beside his mother, the better to inspect these strangers. His little face was grimy. His clothes, cut in the native fashion, were poor and not very clean. And yet he was more white than Aleut, and no one seeing him could doubt his parentage. The seamen had left their posts, and were watching with such absorption that they failed to see a skiff with a single oarsman swing past the stern of the Grande and make fast to the landing. Still unobserved, the man mounted the companionway swiftly. For once in his life, Wayne Wayland was too confused for definite speech. Willis Marsh stood helpless, his plump face slack-jowled and beaded with sweat. He could not yet grasp the completeness of his downfall, and waited anxiously for some further sign from Mildred. It came at last, in a look that scorched him, firing him to a last effort. "Don't believe her," he broke out. "She is lying to protect her own lover." He pointed to Chakawana. "That girl is the child's mother, but his father is Boyd Emerson." "Boyd Emerson was never in Kalvik until last December," said Cherry. "The child is 3 years old." "It seems I am being discussed," said a voice behind them. Emerson clove his way through the sailors, striding directly to Marsh. "What is the meaning of this?" Mildred Wayland laid a fluttering hand upon her breast. "I knew he would come," she breathed. Constantine broke his silence for the first time, addressing Mildred directly. "This baby b'long Mr. Marsh. He say he goin' marry Chakawana, but he lie. He goin' marry you because you a rich girl." He turned to Marsh. "What for you lie, eh?" He leaned forward with a frightful scowl. "I tell you long time ago I kill you if you don't marry my sister." "Now I understand," exclaimed Boyd. "It was you who stabbed him that night in the cannery." "Yes. Chakawana tell him what priest say about woman who don't marry. My sister say she go to hell herself and don't care a damn, but it ain't right for little baby to go to hell too." "What do you mean by that?" asked Mr. Wayland. "The father say if white man take Indian woman and don't marry her, she go to hell for 1,000 year, maybe 3,000 year. Anyhow, she don't never see Jesus house. That's bad thing." The breed shook his head seriously. "Chakawana, she's good girl, and she go to church. I give money to the priest too, plenty money every time, but he say that's no good. She's got to be marry or she burn for always with little baby. By God, that make her scare, because little baby ain't do nothing to burn that way. Mr. Marsh, he say it all damn lie, and he don't care if little baby go to hell. You hear that? He don't care for little baby." Constantine's eyes were full of tears as he strove laboriously to voice his religious teachings. He went on with growing agitation. "Chakawana, she mighty scared of that bad place, and she asked Mr. Marsh again to marry her, but he beat her. That's when I tried to kill him. Maybe Mr. Emerson ain't come so quick Mr. Marsh go to hell himself." Wayne Wayland turned upon Marsh. "Why don't you say something?" "I told you that brat isn't mine," he cried. "If it isn't Emerson's, it's Cherry Malotte's. They want money, but I won't be bled." "You marry my sister?" asked Constantine. "No," snarled Willis Marsh. "You can all go to hell and take the child with you." Without a single warning cry, the breed lunged swiftly. The others saw something gleam in his hand. Emerson jumped for him, and 3 men went to the deck in a writhing tangle, sending the furniture spinning before them. Mildred screamed. The sailors rushed forward, pushing her aside and blotting out her view. The sudden violence of the assault had frightened her nearly out of her senses. She fled to her father, striving to hide her face against his breast, but something drew her eyes back to the spot where the men were clinched. She heard Boyd Emerson cry to the sailors, "Get out of the way! I've got him!" then saw him locked in the Indian's arms. They had gained their feet now and spun backwards, bringing up against the yacht's cabin with a crash of shivering glass. A knife wrenched from the breed's grasp went whirling over the side into the sea. Cherry Malotte ran forward, and at her voice the savage ceased his struggles. Wayne Wayland loosed his daughter's hold and thrust his way in amongst the sailors, kneeling beside the man he had chosen for his son-in-law. Emerson joined him, then rose quickly, crying, "Is there a doctor among your party?" "Dr. Berry. Send for Dr. Berry. He's gone ashore," exclaimed Mr. Wayland. "Quick! Somebody fetch Dr. Berry," Boyd directed. As the sailors drew apart, Mildred Wayland saw a sight that made her grow deathly faint and close her eyes. Turning, she fled blindly into the cabin. A few moments later Emerson found her stretched unconscious at the head of the main stairs, with a hysterical French maid sobbing over her. End of chapter 26.
Chapter 27 of the Silver Horde. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Tech Savvy. The Silver Horde by Rex Beach. Chapter 27. And a dream comes true. For nearly an hour Boyd Emerson sat alone on the deck of the Grande, a prey to conflicting emotions, the while he waited for Mildred to appear. There was no one to dispute his presence now, for the tourists who had followed Dr. Barry from the shore in hushed excitement avoided him, and the sailors made no effort to carry out their earlier instructions. Hence he was allowed opportunity to adjust himself to the sudden change. It was not so much the unexpected downfall of Willis Marsh and the new light thus thrown upon his own enterprise that upset him, as a puzzling alteration in his own purposes and inclinations. He had come out to the yacht defiantly, to make good his threat and to force an understanding with Mildred Wayland. But now that he was here and his way made easy, he began to question his own desires. Now that he thought about it, that note, instead of filling him with dismay, had rather left him relieved. It was as if he had been freed of a burden, and this caused him a vague uneasiness. Was it because he was tired by the struggle for this girl, for whom he had labored so faithfully? After 3 years of unflagged devotion, was he truly relieved to have her dismiss him? Or was it there, in this primal country, stripped of all conventions, he saw her and himself in a new light? He did not know. The late twilight was fading when Mildred came from her stateroom. She found Boyd pacing the deck, a cigar between his teeth. "Where are these people?" she inquired. "They went ashore. Marsh doesn't care to press a charge against the Indian." "I hear he is not badly hurt, after all." "That is true, but it was a close shave." Mildred shuddered. "It was horrible. I never dreamed that Constantine would do such a thing. But he is more Russian than Aleut, and both he and his sister are completely under the spell of the priest. They are intensely religious, and their idea of damnation is very vivid." "Have you seen father?" "We had a short talk." "Did you make up?" "No, but I think he is beginning to understand things better, at least as far as Marsh is concerned. The rest is only a matter of time." "What a frightful situation! Why did you ever let father announce my engagement to that man?" Emerson gazed at her in astonishment. "I? Pardon me? How could I help it?" "You might have avoided quarrelling with him. I think you're very inconsiderate of me." Boyd regarded the coal of his cigar with a slight gleam of amusement in his eyes as she ran on. "Even that woman took occasion to humiliate me in the worst possible way." "It strikes me that she did you a very great service. I have no doubt it was quite as distasteful to her as to you." "Absurd! It was her chance for revenge, and she rejoiced in making me ridiculous." "Then it is the first ignoble thing I ever knew her to do," said Boyd slowly. "She has helped me in 100 ways. Without her assistance I could never have won through. That cannery site would still be grown up to moss and trees, and I would still be a disheartened dreamer." "It's very nice of you, of course, to appreciate what she has done, but she can't help you any more. You surely don't intend to keep up your acquaintance with her now?" He made no reply, and taking his silence for agreement, she went on. "The trip home will be terribly dull for me, I'm afraid. I think, yes, I shall have father ask you to go back with us." "But I'm right in the midst of the run. I can't leave the business." "Oh, business! Do you care more for business than for me? I don't think you realize how terribly hard for me all this has been. I am still frightened. I shall die of nervousness without someone to talk to." "It's quite impossible. I don't want to go back now." "Indeed, and no doubt it was impossible for you to come out here last night for the same reason." "It was, The fish struck in, and I could not leave." "It was that woman who kept you," cried Mildred. "It is because of her that you refuse to leave this country." "Please don't," he said quietly. "I've never thought of her in that way." "Then come away from this wretched place. The whole country, the fisheries, the people, everything. This isn't your proper sphere. Why come away now at once and begin something new, something worthwhile?" "Do you realize the hopes, the heartaches, the vital effort I've put into this enterprise?" he questioned. But she only said, "I don't like it. It isn't a nice business. Let father take the plant over. If you need money, I have plenty." "Wait," he interrupted sharply. "Sit down. I want to talk to you." He drew the wrap closer about her shoulders and led her to a deck chair. The change in him was becoming more apparent. He knew now that he had never felt the same since his first meeting with Mildred upon the arrival of the Grand Dame. Even then she had repelled him by her lack of sympathy. She had shown no understanding of his efforts, and now she revealed as complete a failure to grasp his code of honor. It never occurred to her that any loyalty of man to man could offset her simple will. She did not see that his desertion of George would be nothing short of treachery. It seemed to him all at once that they had little in common. She was wrapped completely in the web of her own desires. She would make her prejudices a law for him. Above all, she could not respond to the exultation of his success. She had no conception of the pride of accomplishment that is the wine of every true man's life. He had waged a bitter fight, that she had sapped his every soul. He had made and won the struggle that a man makes once in a lifetime. And now, just when he had proved himself strong and fair in the sight of his fellows, she asked him to forego it all. Engrossed in her own egoism, she required of him a greater sacrifice than any he had made. Now that he had shown his strength, she wanted to load him down with golden fetters, to make him a dependent. Was it because she feared another girl? She had tried to help him, he knew, in her own way, and the thought of it touched him. That was like the Mildred he had always known, to act fearlessly, heedless of what her father might say or do. Somehow he had never felt more convinced of the sincerity of her love, but he found himself thinking of it as something of the past. After all, what she had done had been little, considering her power. She had given carelessly out of her abundance. While Cherry, he saw it all now, and a sudden sense of loyalty and devotion to the girl who had really shared his struggles swept over him in a warm tide. It was most unlike his distant worship of Mildred. She had been his dream, but the other was born of his bone and flesh of his flesh. For a long time the two sat talking while these thoughts took gradual form in the young man's mind, and although the deck was deserted, Miss Wayland had no need now to curb her once headstrong wooer. He could not put into words the change that was working in him, but she saw it, and grasping its meaning at last, she began to battle like a mother for her child. His awakening had been slow, and hers was even slower. But once she found her power over him waning, her sense of loss grew and grew as he failed to answer to her half-spoken appeal. Woman-like, she capitulated at last. What matter if he stayed here where his hopes were centered? The life in the north had claimed him, and she would wait until he came for her. But still he did not respond, and it was not long until she had persuaded herself that his battle with the wilderness had put red blood into his veins, and his conduct had been no worse than that of other men. Finally she tried to voice these thoughts, but she only led him to a stiff denial of the charges she wished to forgive. As she saw him slipping further away from her, she summoned all her arts to rekindle the flame which had burned so steadily. And when these failed, she surrounded every prejudice. It was his love she wanted. All else was secondary. At last she knew herself. She could have cried at the sudden realization that he had not kissed her since their parting in Chicago. and when she saw he had no will to do so, the memory of his last embrace arose to torture her. She was almost glad when a launch bringing her father came from the shore, and the old man joined them. The two men bore themselves with unbending formality, unable as yet to forget their mutual wrongs. The interruption gave Boyd the opportunity he had not been brave enough to make, and he bade them both good-bye, for the tide was at its flood, and the hour of their departure was at hand. There was a meaningless exchange of words and a handshake in the glare from the cabin lights that showed Mildred's pallid lips and frightened eyes. Then immersion went over the side and darkness swallowed him up. The girl clutched at her father's arm, standing as if frozen, while the creak of rowlocks grew fainter and fainter and died away. Then she turned. "You see, he came," she said. The old man saw the agony that blanched her cheeks, and answered gently, "Yes, daughter." He struggled with himself. "And if you wish it, he may come again." "But he won't come again. That is what makes it so hard. He will never come back." She turned away, but not quickly enough to keep him from seeing that her eyes were wet. Wayland beheld what he would have given half his mighty fortune to prevent. He cried out angrily, but she anticipated his thought. "No, no, you must never injure him again, for he was right and we were wrong. You see, I couldn't understand." He left her staring into the night and walked heavily below. Emerson felt a great sense of relief and deliverance as he leaned against his oars. His heart sank to the murmur of the waters overside. For the first time in many months he felt young and free. How blind he had been, and how narrow had been his escape from a life that could lead him to one result. The girl was sweet and good and wonderful in many ways, but 3 years had altered him more than he had realized. He had begun to understand himself that very afternoon, when Cherry had told him her own unhappy secret. The shock of her disclosure had aroused him from his dream, and once he began to see himself as he really was, the rest had come quickly. He had been doubtful even when he went out on the yacht, but what had happened there had destroyed the last trace of uncertainty. He knew that for him there was but one woman in all the world. It was no easy battle he had fought with himself. He had been reared to respect the conventions, and he knew that Cherry's life had not been all he could wish. But he fronted the issue squarely, and tried to throttle his inbred prejudice. Although he had felt the truth of Fraser's arguments and of Cherry's own words, he had still refused to yield until his love for the girl swept over him in all its power. Then he made his choice. The one thing he found most difficult to accept was her conduct with Hilliard. Those other charges against the girl were vague and shadowy, but this was concrete, and he was familiar with every miserable detail of it. It took all his courage to face it, but he swore savagely that if the conditions had been reversed, Cherry would not have faltered for an instant. Moreover, what she had been done for love of him. It was worse than vile to hesitate. Her past was her own, and all he could rightfully claim was her future. He shut his teeth and laid his course resolutely for her landing, striving to leave behind this one hideous memory, centering his mind upon the girl herself and shutting out her past. It was the bitterest fight he had ever waged, but when he reached the shore and tied his skiff, he was exalted by the knowledge that he had triumphed, and that this painful episode was locked away with all the others. Now that he had conquered, he was filled with consuming eagerness. As he stole up through the shadows, he heard her playing, and when he drew near, he recognized the notes of that song that had banished his own black desolation on the night of their first meeting. He paused outside the open window and saw by the shaded lamplight what she was playing from memory, her fingers wandering over the keyboard without conscious effort. Then she took up the words, with all the throbbing tenderness that lives in a deep, contralto voice. "Last night I was dreaming of thee, love, was dreaming. I dreamt thou didst promise. Cherry paused as if entranced, for she thought she heard another voice join with hers. Then she bowed her head and sobbed in utter wretchedness, knowing it for nothing more than her own fancy. Too many times, as in other twilights past, she had heard the mellow voice blend with hers, only to find that her ears had played her false, and she was alone with a memory that would never die. Of all the days of her life, this was the saddest, this hour the loneliest, and the tears she had withheld so bravely as long as there was work to do came now in unbidden profusion. To face these people on the yacht had been an act of pure devotion to Boyd, for her every instinct had rebelled against it. Yet she had known that some desperate stroke in his defence must be delivered instantly. Otherwise the ruin of all his hopes would follow. She had hit upon the device of using Constantine and Chokavuna largely by chance, for not until the previous day she had learned the truth. She had not dared to hope for such unqualified success, nor had she foreseen the tragic outcome. She had simply carried her plan through to its natural conclusion. Now that her work was done, she gave way completely and wept like a little girl. He was out there now with his love. They would never waste a thought upon the other girl who made their happiness possible. The thought was almost more than she could ever bear. Never again could she have Boyd to herself, never enjoy his careless friendship as of old. Even that was over now that he knew the truth. The first and the only kiss he had ever given her burned fresh upon her lips. She recalled that evening they had spent alone in this very room, when he had seemed to waver and her hopes had risen at the dawning of a new light in his eyes. At the memory she cried aloud, as if her heart would break. "Boyd! Boyd!" He entered noiselessly and took her in his arms. "Yes, dear," he murmured, but she rose with a startled exclamation and wrenched herself from his embrace. The piano gave forth a discordant crash. Shrinking back as from an apparition, she stared into his flushed and smiling face, then breathed. "You! Why are you here?" "Because I love you." She closed her eyes and swayed as if under the spell of wonderful music. He saw the throbbing pulse at her throat. Then she flung out her hands, crying piteously, "Go away, please, before I find it is only another dream." She raised her lids to find him still standing there, then felt him with fluttering fingers. "Our dreams have come true," he said gently, and strove to imprison her hand. "No, no," her voice broke wildly. "You don't mean it. You haven't come to stay." "I have come to stay, if you will let me, dear." She broke from his grasp and moved quickly away. "Why are you here? I left you out there with her. I made your way clear. Why have you come back? What more can I do? Dear God, what more can I do?" She was panting as if desperately frightened. "There is nothing but one thing more you can do to make me happy. You can be my wife." "But I don't understand." She shook her head hopelessly. "You're jesting with me. You love Miss Wayland." "No, Miss Wayland leaves tonight, and I shall never see her again." "Then you won't marry her?" "No." A dull color rose to cherry mulattish cheeks. She swallowed as if her throat was very dry, and said slowly, "Then she refused you in spite of everything, and you have come to me because of what I told you this afternoon? You're doing this out of pity, or is it because you're angry with her?" "No, no, Boyd. I won't have it. I don't want your pity. I don't want what she cast off." "It has taken me a long time to find myself, Cherry, for I have been blinded by a vision," he answered. "I have been dreaming, and I never saw clearly till today. I came away for my own free will, and I came straight to you, because it is you I love and shall always love." The girl suddenly began to beat her hands together. "You forget what I've been. she cried in a voice that tore her lover's heartstrings. "You can't want to marry me?" "Tonight," he said, simply, and held out his arms to her. "I love you and I want you. That is all I know or care about." He found her upon his breast, and sobbing and shaking as if she had sought shelter there from some great peril, he buried his face in the soft masses of her hair, whispering fondly to her till her emotion spent itself. She turned her face shyly up at length and pressed her lips to his. Then, holding herself away from him, she said, with a half doubtful yet radiant look, "It is not too late yet. I will give you one final chance to save yourself." He shook his head. "Then I have done my duty." She snuggled closer to him. "And you have no regrets?" "Only one. I'm sorry that I can't give you more than my name. I may have to go out into the world and begin all over if Mr. Wayland carries out his threat. I may be the poorest of the poor." "That will be my opportunity to show you how well I love you. You can be no poorer than I in this world's goods." "You at least have your copper mine." "I have no mine," said the girl. "Not even the smallest interest in one." But I don't understand." She dropped her eyes. "Mr. Hilliard is a hard man to deal with. I had to give him all my share in the claims." "I suppose you mean you sold out to him?" "No. When I found you could not raise the money, I gave him my share in the mine. With that as a consideration, he made you the loan. You're not angry, are you?" "Angry?" Emerson's tone conveyed a supreme gladness. "You don't know how happy you have made me." "Hark!" She laid a finger upon his lips. Through the breathless night there came the faint rumble of a ship's chains. "The Grande Dame!" he cried. "She sails at the flood tide." They stood together in the open doorway of the little house and watched the yacht's lights as they described a great curve through the darkness, then slowly faded into nothingness down the bay. Cherry drew herself closer to Boyd. "What a wonderful Providence guides us, after all," she said. "That girl had everything in the world, and I was so poor, until this hour. God grant she may some day be as rich as I." Out on the Grande Dame, the girl who had everything in the world maintained a lonely vigil at the rail, straining with tragic eyes until the sombre shadows that marked the shores of the land she feared had shrunk to a faint, low-lying streak on the horizon. Then she turned and went below, numbed by the knowledge that she was very poor and very wretched, and had never understood. The End. End of chapter 27. Recording by TechSavvy. www.techsavvy.wordpress.com. End of The Silver Horde by Rex Beach.